Yeah, I've got YouTube open, so if you come on, if I see you, then I know we're good, right?
All right, we're on right now, in fact. Hello and welcome to Flat Earth and Other Hot Potatoes. This is episode number 225, with an accent on the hot potatoes. Maybe we should retitle the show Paul is Dead and Other Hot Potatoes. My guest is Mike Williams of the YouTube channel Sage of Quay Radio Hour, and in the description box you will find it. Please subscribe. Mike has been on with me before, and I've been on his channel before. Today we're going to talk about things that don't have anything to do with flat Earth, or do they? Because truth has been hidden from us, and we all know that. And perhaps the Paul is Dead controversy is all part of the same machine. Mike Williams, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Patricia, for having me come on the show to talk about this topic. It seems like a lot of people are very interested in it, so that's why I keep talking about it.
You've been on many people's shows talking about it. You've interviewed several people about it. And it seems like you're becoming the resident expert on the PID conspiracy.
Yeah, that's interesting because the way this all got started was I read this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas Hugh Harriot, back in the summer of 2016. And why I picked this book up after reading so many books over so many years about the Beatles, I have no idea. I ordered it from Amazon. I started reading it, and I just could not believe what I was reading. And I was very well aware of the Paul is Dead conspiracy for a very long time. In fact, when I was a kid back in 1976, I actually put together in my high school a Paul is Dead clues little lecture.
Is that like the flat Earth clues?
Yeah. Well, what happened was I had a friend of mine, Adam, and he had an older brother, Doug, and Doug was he was probably 3 or 4 years older than us, and he knew all about these Beatle clues. And I was a Beatle freak ever since I can remember. I went to see Yellow Submarine when it first came out in 1968, and I got maybe a weird little kid because I was only 9 years old, and I knew exactly what I was going to see. So I was into the Beatles at a very, very young age. So back in 76, I asked my friend's brother, Doug, if he would come to the high school and present the clues. So I was very aware of them. The thing is that I thought it was a marketing ploy.
That's what I've always thought. I've heard about them for many years, thought it was interesting and dismissed it, and really started taking it seriously when I heard interviews that you'd done, of all things.
Yeah, so what happened was I read the book, and I was talking to Sophia Smallstorm. Sophia's a good friend, and I said to her, "Hey, I'm reading this book called The Memoirs of Billy Shears. You're not going to believe what's in this book." And so I told her a little bit about it, and she said to me, "Oh, you have to come on my show. Let's do a podcast on it." And I really dragged my feet, Patricia. I didn't really want to become the Paul is Dead guy.
You are, sorry.
But it's okay now. It's okay. In fact, on my second or third show, I was with Mark Devlin, who's a good friend. And on that show, I said to Mark, this is the last Paul is Dead show I'm going to do. And that was back in 2016. Maybe it was December. So here I am. I'm still talking about it. So I kept putting it off and figuring Sophia would just forget about it. You know, all these other things we have cooking, and she wouldn't, circle back, and she did. And she kept asking me, "Are you done with that book yet?" Because I kept telling her I have to finish the book. So finally, I said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." And in order to do it, folks, the book is 666 pages. It's 66 chapters. So one of the reasons why I dragged my feet, other than not wanting to be the Paul is Dead guy, is that I had to break down the book. And to break the book down, I have a slideshow. Tonight, there's 60 slides, but the actual master deck has about 70 slides in it in order for me to break down everything that is contained in this book. The book is classified as historical fiction, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because the man who's playing the character of Paul McCartney, his name is William Wallace Shepard, Bill Shepard. Some people might call him Campbell, last name, or Shears. I explain to folks that I don't get hung up on the last name. Shepard, Shears, Campbell, it could be Smith, Jones, it doesn't matter. What we need to focus on is the magnitude of the Tavistock psyop, because this is a Tavistock psyop.
And that's where the connection, in my opinion, where flat Earth comes into all of this. You and I both are flat earthers, but it's all part of this deception. There's so many layers, and the time frame when this began is around the same time the time frame with all the NASA fakery was also going on. So
it was very interesting how it came about. The book actually came out September 9th, 2009, so 999. So we're already into the occult numbers. And I picked it up 7 years later, and it really started to get traction once I started, I'm not patting myself on the back, but I reintroduced this book, if you will, back into the dialogue, into the public discourse. And I don't know, why it happened that way. I tell folks that I have absolutely no connection into this book. There's no financial connection. There's none of that. I didn't even know Tom Harriet, the author. In fact, when I got done reading the book, Patricia, I had emailed Tom and asked him to come on my show to talk about the book. Initially, Tom had said he would. And then about a week later, he contacted me. And he says, Mike, I really apologize, but I can't come on the show. I can't go on any shows to talk about the book. So my guess is what happened is, everybody involved in this book has signed non-disclosures, confidentiality agreements, otherwise known as secrecy agreements. And I don't know this for sure, but I suspect what happened was Tom mentioned it to somebody, maybe an attorney, and they said, look, you can't go on shows, because as careful as you may want to be about talking about this, you could say something that would breach the agreement. And then there could be legal issues. So the book is framed as historical fiction, even though it's very obvious through 666 pages. The content is almost overwhelming, the details, that the book contains an enormous amount of truth. There is some fiction in it, and they had to do that in order to call the book historical fiction. And also, they had to have a thread of fiction in order to put the book out. Otherwise, it would have been a breach of these legal contracts I just spoke about. Now, other people have said, I'll just cover a couple of things beforehand. So I have no connection to this book other than the fact that the Beatles were like my life from a music perspective. I learned to write music, play music, record because of the Beatles. Some folks have said to me that Tom Harriet is not a real person. Tom is a real person. Tom is now a friend of mine on Facebook. We're not like best buds, but we are acquaintances. I have dialogued with Tom on and off over the last couple of years that had to do with the book. He has been extremely graceful in getting back to me with additional information to the level or the degree in which he could share it. So it's been very good. And I'll cover some of those things. Just remind me as we go through this, and I'll cover some of those conversations that Tom and I had. One of them I'll mention now is I had an email conversation with him. And there's a chapter in the book about Phil April. Phil April was in a band called The Diplomats with Denny Lane back in the early 1960s. And Bill Shepard played the part of Phil April. So he was Phil April as well. But initially in the book, in that chapter, the way it was written, it was very ambiguous. So I wrote to Tom and I said, hey, Tom, this page or this chapter you have, actually there's a couple of pages that talked about the diplomats and one paragraph or two paragraphs in particular. I said, was he or was he not Phil April? I said, the way it's written, it's very fuzzy. And he said to me, Mike, you read it exactly the way it was supposed to have been read, intentionally fuzzy. And I said, well, it would be good to know whether he was Phil April or not. So Tom wrote me back and he said, okay, let me go back to the boxes that I have, the files I have. Okay, so this is very interesting, right? So I don't think he meant to tell me that, but when he wrote it, and if he's listening to this, he's probably cringing right now. But what I read was he had received, obviously, boxes of files that had to be categorized impeccably for him to go back and to be able to pick out certain amounts of information or certain content just like that. In other words, you didn't have to rummage through a bunch of paper and stuff like that. He went back to a specific file. I'm assuming that file had said Phil April. So the net of it was, and I'll cover this in the presentation, he said to me that he's going to update the book, and he updated the book in October of 2016 and made it clearer that Shepherd was Phil April. Okay, so that was most likely, that update to Memoirs was most likely because of the discussion that I had with Tom to try to clarify that some more. Because that was a long time rumor that Phil April was one of the replacements of biological Paul McCartney. And you'll hear me refer to the original Paul McCartney as biological Paul. And so I thought it should be clarified. He also, in that email, he said to me, Mike, there's another clue. And he says it's in the song Rock Show when McCartney was with Wings and on the album Venus and Mars. So the song that starts off the Venus and Mars album is a song called Rock Show. And there is a lyric in there, and I'll go through it later on in the presentation, but just to cut to the chase here, he talks about Silly Willie, Billy of the Philly Phil April Band could be ooh-wee. So what we're going to go through here is that Bill has clues all over the place. He all over the place. He's got clues in Band on the Run. And I'll take the audience through that too.
And by Bill, you mean Bio-Paul, Sir Paul McCartney, the one we know today.
I'm talking about Bill Shepherd.
Oh, Bill Shepherd.
Bill Shepherd, who is the person that's playing the character of Paul McCartney.
Of course.
And he can call himself Paul McCartney. This is my own analysis based upon a lot of work I did with Strawman and corporate fictions. But Paul McCartney is a corporate fiction. It's not the biological Paul. It would be like if you had a business, Patricia, and somebody said, "Oh, are you the ABC company?" And you would say, "Well, yes, I run the ABC company, or I am the ABC company." And so that's how he plays it. So Paul McCartney is a corporate fiction. Think of it as it's a business. It's a corporation. The biological person is Bill Shepherd, William Shepherd. You see?
I get it now.
That's how it works. Again, this is my analysis of how it works and how he's able to do this, because he is a gigantic enterprise. That's the other thing everybody has to understand. He's worth enormous amounts of money. Enormous. So anyway, with that, do you have any other questions?
Well, the Bio-Paul supposedly died in a car accident in 1966.
Right. That's right.
And the first start of the space program was in February of 1967, when there was a Apollo 1. They did some testing, and it had an incident on the launch pad. And this time frame in the 60s is so important to all of the things that we deal with today, and the late 50s as well, but all of the brainwashing. What we're about to talk about are many proofs that the Paul McCartney we know today is not the original Paul, but there's a larger game afoot, yes, which is the Tavistock Institute and the control of our society, and the way our minds can be controlled, and how they are in some way enjoying the controlling of us and testing us to see how much we will buy.
Right. So I just did a show with Crow 777, and the title of that show is Anything Worth Knowing is a Lie. And I stand by that. As you go more and more dig further and further into the research. It doesn't matter what area you're looking into. It could be the McCartney conspiracy. It could be geoengineering. It could be the Earth. It could be anything. Vaccines. The rabbit holes are so deep. And if you do the due diligence and you do your homework and you do your research, you will come to the conclusion that you are being lied to. And the reason why they lie is because that's how they maintain control, period. If people are unknowing, they refer to us as profane. If you're unknowing and profane, there's no way for you to take control of anything because you don't know what it is you don't know, but they do. And that's why they keep us in the dark. And they use music. Now, Mark Devlin and I have talked about this a lot. Music is a social engineering tool. That's what it is. And a lot of people get very upset when Mark and I talk about this and say things like that because to many people, their bands are sacred to them. And it just brings, so much passion and, people can relax to music and it brings them back in time. They can hear a song and, I remember what I was doing back then when that song came out. And so there's a lot of memories and stuff like that. And I get it because I have the same thing. I mean, this is a very hard pill for me to swallow about the Beatles. A very hard pill to swallow. But the truth of the matter is the music business, especially the pop music industry, is completely controlled and it's used as a social engineering tool and mind control, period. And Bill Shepherd came on in 1967 to usher in the psychedelic era.
Yes.
That's what his role was back in 1967. And I'll get into that too. And people's eyes are going to pop out of their heads when they see what was really going on and what the connections are.
On the surface, when you just first hear about this, it sounds crazy. But what you're about to see perhaps will change your mind. It certainly did mine. Anyway, Mike, let's go with the slides.
Okay, let me make sure I get this right.
While you're setting it up, I want to greet everybody in the live chat. Thank you for being here. Mike Williams' channel is listed in the description box of this video. Give it a subscribe, please. And you can share this video on social media. It is very interesting. It is definitely a hot potato. And it's not just about, another musician replaced a musician, so what's the big deal? It's symptomatic of what's going on in our society today and probably will in the future.
Now, it's a very big deal, Patricia. I'm glad you mentioned that because this is where we have to start. They replaced and swapped out one of the most famous musicians and entertainers of the most famous rock band at the height of its popularity in 1966. And virtually nobody noticed and nobody cared. So that's a very important thing that we have to keep in our mind as we go through this. This swap wasn't made at a point when nobody cared. This swap was made at the height of the Beatles' popularity, right after they recorded and released the Revolver album back in 1966. The other thing I also want to, the point I want to make is I do not discount the fact that perhaps biological Paul didn't die, but was just replaced and swapped out. That's possible. Okay. So I don't want to get into that argument because there's no way of really knowing one way or another, but I will say this. I do lean toward the fact that he's not with us anymore. I do lean in that direction. And the reason is because it's just a lot easier to manage this when the person that you replace is not around anymore. But I don't discount the fact that he just stepped out for whatever reason and he took on another persona or whatever. Okay. So I just want to make sure I say that too.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I was thinking how sad it would be for original Paul McCartney to die and maybe other than a private funeral and his close friends and family grieving, he had been, as a human being, lost. And maybe he did walk into another role. How do we know? Maybe he did.
We don't know. And that's the thing. And we may never know, although I did contact Tom and I said, Tom, are you working on something for this September 9th? And I said, because this September 9th is 999 also. September 9th, 2018. So the 18 at the end of 2018, right? The sum of those numbers is 9. And it would be 9 years after the initial release of Memoirs. So then we have 999 again. And in the book, he says McCartney, the biological Paul, is all about the number 9, the nines. And Billy says that he's all about the sixes. And Tom wrote me back and said, Mike, I like the way you think. And he says, I'm working on some stuff, and that's all he said. So he writes other stuff, so I don't know whether he's working on something that has nothing to do with Memoirs or it has something to do with Memoirs. But at some point, I do believe the truth will come out. And I think it will come out because Shepard has reached a point now where he's old. He's 5 years old in the biological Paul. He's 81 years old today. And nobody knows who he is. And he wrote all of these songs for over 50 years. And everybody thinks it was written by a guy that hadn't been there since the fall of 1966. So I think that there's a big, big piece of him. In fact, I did have this conversation with Tom via comments in Facebook, and he agreed that a big reason why this is coming out now is because, hey, I'm Bill Shepard. I wrote these songs. Okay, so we're seeing that start to play out. And like I said, he's 81 years old today. So the runway that he has left is shortening by the day. Can you see my charts, Patricia?
Yes, I can. It's the Memoirs of Billy Shears is what we see on the screen, and the live chat assures me that the screen is clear and showing.
Okay. So Patricia, if you have any questions, just stop me. Don't let me babble on. If something catches your interest, or anybody in the chat room, just stop me, and I will address the questions best I can. Also, if the comments I make are my own insights, I will do the best I can to say they are mine and not contained within the book. These charts here are about the book. I want to make that clear also, so that people understand the context. Okay, so the Memoirs of Billy Shears, as I mentioned, is 666 pages of in-depth detail. It claims that Paul McCartney died on September 11th, 1966. He died in a car crash when he was leaving the studio after receiving song assignments from Brian Epstein. He evidently, I guess, wasn't happy about the number of songs he had to write, and I guess the time frame in which he had to write them. So he was a little agitated as he got into his car. Along the way, as the story goes, and I know some people don't believe the car crash story. Again, this is what's in Memoirs.
But also, there's so many clues about the car crash in many songs.
Yes.
He blew his mind out in a car,
Yep,
and so many others.
Exactly. So we have car crash clues. You're absolutely right. He picked up a female passenger. Her name was Donna. Along the way, the car crash was very bad. It says that he was decapitated. It's gruesome. He was replaced by William Bill Shepard. His middle name is Wallace, William Wallace Shepard. We'll get into that in a little bit. He states, the book is written in the first person, by the way. Tom is the author / encoder. I will explain the encoder in a moment. But it's actually Shepard speaking to us. He states the Beatles were and still are a Tavistock project. The Beatles are an occult Masonic creation, and I'll get into that. There's a whole chapter dedicated to Freemasonry. Virtually all the Beatles songs post 9/11/66 include Paul is dead clues. That was a little bit disheartening. The occult origins and underpinnings of what they were engaged in, the Beatles with Bill Shepard at the helm, is referred to as Paulism. And what they mean by Paulism is it's mysticism, it's occult, it's Satanism. It's Crowley's mysticism and magic, if you want to look at it from that perspective. So there's a heavy, heavy occult context that is wrapped all around the Beatles. So let's talk about Tom a little bit. Tom is referred to as the encoder more than he is the author. He is an author, poet, philosopher, speaker, teacher. He attended Brigham Young University. and he has a degree in what's his degree in? I think it's in writing. So he went to Brigham Young. Which is owned and operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is the Mormons, and the Mormons and the Freemasons are connected at the hip. Okay, so in very early shows, I had surmised that Tom was a Freemason, a high-level Freemason, while he went to Brigham Young, and I believe that 97 to 98% of the student population at Brigham Young University are Mormons. And as I mentioned, Mormonism and Freemasonry are connected at the hip. In fact, Mormonism was created by the Freemasons, and you can go do the research on that. The publishing of the book was very low key and unassuming. It was done through CreateSpace, which is an independent publishing platform on Amazon. But Shepard has a history of under the radar work. So there is an album he came out with in the 70s called Thrillington, which was an orchestra arrangement of the album Ram. Ram, by the way, stands for Replacing a McCartney. That's in the book, Memoirs, The Fireman, and so on. So he has done a lot of work in the past where he has hidden his identity or has gone uncredited. So this is not something that I found unusual, that this book would also be flying under the radar. The book is published by Pepper Press, which is a subsidiary of Mac Corporation. However, I was not able to verify Pepper Press or Mac Corp back to McCartney's MPL business entity. I tried and tried to see if I can find the linkages, but they weren't there. Now, that doesn't mean it's not linked. It just says that I couldn't find it. The domain used by Tom U. Harriet is billyshears.com. Now, everybody who's out there that has a website or has domains, think about how difficult it would be to get the domain billyshears.com. It would be virtually impossible because billyshears.com would have been picked up and secured a long time ago.
Yes, there's people who do that, any sort of interesting keywords in pop culture. And if it's in a song like Billy Shears,
right,
it is in a Beatles song, somebody would have snatched that to try to get a lot of money for it in the future.
Exactly. So now when I went into Whois to look at billyshears.com, when I did look at it, I don't know if it says that now, but it does have Tom as the owner. But, that doesn't mean that it's not connected to McCartney or to Shepard. It doesn't mean that. It just means that, to me, that Tom could very well be the veneer. Okay. Most of the material in the book is based on words by the current Paul McCartney, Bill Shepard. And this is stated in the book and also on the billyshears.com website. However, Harriet, Tom took liberties with dialogue and other elements to ensure that the book is a work of historical fiction. Some parts are exact quotes. Some quotes were modified to fit the code or the narrative, and sometimes the settings were modified. Okay, so again, remember, they had to have a thread of fiction in the book in order to keep it from being classified as nonfiction or truthful, because it would jeopardize Shepard's contractual agreements that he has. And someone might ask, well, who are these contractual agreements with? I believe, again, this is a guess on my part, probably a pretty good guess, with Tavistock, British intelligence, and so on. In the book, in the beginning of the book, Tom thanks Sir J. Paul McCartney for providing such fantastic material. The book is written in the first person, which is Bill Shepard, and due to legal implications, again, this is my opinion, it is highly unlikely this is an unauthorized biography. So some people have said to me, well, how do you know he just didn't sit down and write this book? I said, well, I guess it's possible. But we're going to get into a little bit about what is entailed in this book. And for somebody to sit down and put the level of work, especially the encoding into the book, and I'll explain it in a moment, is a daunting task. It's overwhelming. And I do believe that something like this, because McCartney or Shepard playing McCartney holds things very close to the vest. In fact, if you want to understand how close to the vest, try putting a YouTube video up with a Beatles song in it. You won't even complete the upload. Okay, so things are, like I said, held very close to the vest. All right, so let's go to an overview of Bill himself. The source is the Memoirs of Billy Shears, which was released on September 9th, 2009, 666 pages. The abridged version is a book called Billy's Back. That's about 250 pages. I actually started reading that book first, and I finished it. And I was so knocked out by the abridged version. I then read the big book, the 666 pages. As I mentioned, Paul died on September 11th, 1966. Some researchers will argue with this date, so I want to acknowledge that. I believe Tina Foster, who's a friend of mine, friend on Facebook, I also interviewed Tina. I think she believes biological Paul died in August of 66. Some will say it was November 9th of 1966. And again, my response back to anybody who argues the dates is that I'm not really that interested in the dates, because again, we want to bring our focus back to the Tavistock psyop. That's what we want to bring our attention to. Everything else becomes a distraction. So arguing about his last name, a distraction. The actual date, a distraction. We want to focus on what they pulled off here because it's still going on. So biological Paul was replaced by, at the time, an unknown session musician. His name is Bill Shepherd, or William Wallace Shepherd. He has aliases. He was Billy Shears from the Sgt. Pepper album. With a little help from my friends, that's how it kicks off. Billy Shepherd, he was Vivian Stanshall, and some people are very intrigued by this, and they don't see the connection at first, but I'll show you that. Vivian Stanshall was very well known in the UK, not very well known here in the States, and he was with a band called the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. And in that band, he played with Neil Innes. And for those that are Beatle aficionados or Beatle freaks and know about the Ruddles were a Beatles parody band. And who was one of the main protagonists of the Ruddles, the main songwriter? Well, Neil Innes, okay, who played with Vivian Stanshall in the Doodah Band. He goes by Billy Pepper, and he was also Phil Ackrell of the Diplomats when he played with Denny Lane back in the early 1960s. And when the Beatles were over, he actually dissolved the Beatles. And I'll talk a little bit about that because of the friction with the other band members. They really did have a difficult time getting along, the other three with him. It was good sometimes, but it was also not so good many other times. So there was kind of this good day, bad day type of dynamic going on with the band. So when the Beatles broke up and Shepherd decided to form Wings, he brought his old friend Denny Lane back into the picture.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I know you're on a roll, but there's no way to do this other than to interrupt occasionally with questions like you suggested. Linda McCartney, Paul and Linda's daughter, Stella McCartney.
Yes.
Linda is gone. Stella is a fashion designer. Do you think that they know?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My personal belief is that they know. Yes. Linda knew. In Nick Kollestrom's book, Nick wrote a book on this as well. He has a very interesting paragraph or two where he recalls some information he had received where at the time, biological Paul was dating Jane Asher. And so when Paul died, the controllers behind this whole thing, they had worked it so that Shepherd would be seen with Jane Asher and to pretend that this relationship was still going on. Never mind that he was now much taller than her. He's taller than biological Paul. And but he had fancied Linda Eastman, who later became Linda McCartney. And Linda Eastman was a photographer, and she used to photograph bands, and that's what she did back in the day. And the way Nick tells the story is that he had approached Linda, and he had, he was interested in her, and he was he wanted to date her and get to know her better. And she made a comment and she said, "No worries. I know who you are and I know who you are not."
Wow.
So she knew. She knew. And
How did she, how was her silence bought? I mean, the Kodak family, I know that company is dissolved now, but I mean,
she wasn't with that.
billionaires.
That's not Eastman Kodak.
Oh, you're talking about.
They are lawyers.
Okay, got it.
She came from a very wealthy family of attorneys. If I'm not mistaken, her father was an attorney. And she was in the music scene back in those days, and that's how they connected. So I don't think there was buying off anybody. I personally believe that Linda knew that she married Bill Shepherd, and that he was playing this character called Paul McCartney. I believe his children know, and it's a big reason why he can't overtly come out and talk about this stuff. At least not yet. I think there is a time limit. I do believe. And he kind of alludes to this in the book, that there is a timing out. There is a point at which he's going to be allowed to say something. It's just not yet. And I do believe his family, his children know that he's not
He's
Paul
alluded
McCartney.
to it jokingly
Yes.
on talk shows.
Yes. I mean, the one that's probably the most famous, where he was speaking kind of cryptically, but if you were paying attention and you know the background, was the 2009 interview that he did with David Letterman.
Yes.
That was very telling. And also there was an interview that was done in 2016 or 2017 with Denny Lane. And I'll talk about that a little bit, where Denny pretty much spills the beans. Okay. Shepherd is a formally trained musician and can read, write, and score music. Now, we've always been told that the Beatles can't read or write music. Well, that's true for John, George, and Ringo, but it is not true for Bill Shepherd. He's a trained musician. He is Scottish. He's a direct descendant, I should say, of William Wallace, who was the character portrayed by Mel Gibson in Braveheart. So he has Scottish blue blood. He is a high-ranking Mason and has a very deep understanding of the occult and the esoteric. This is all spelled out in the book. He's 5 years older than biological Paul. I mentioned that before. He was born in 1937, not 1942. He claims that biological Paul works through him from the other side. So we get into this whole occulted ritual, unseen forces place. It gets kind of creepy for some people. We'll talk about that a little bit. And he wrote the book.
There's a few requests from the chat
to
see if you can, as they are saying it, go full screen or zoom in closer, because some of the fine print is not able to be read.
Better?
I didn't notice a change. Try again. Go back, toggle back and forth so we can check.
Okay, this might be a little difficult in the format. That's not full screen.
They're exactly the same. So let's just go with it.
Just
You're going to say everything that's on the screen.
Yeah, just kind of bear with me, guys, okay, and gals. I'll read it, and trust me, these are the words on the chart. And he wrote the book because he's at a point now where he has been playing the part of Paul McCartney for over 50 years. He's written all these songs, and nobody knows who Bill Shepherd is. Who's Bill Shepherd? Well, Bill Shepherd's the guy that wrote the songs on Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, The White Album, Let It Be, Yellow Submarine, and on and on and on. But nobody knows this. I talked about the fact that the book is referred to as historical fiction because of non-disclosures and confidentiality agreements, which prohibit a non-fiction classification. And I talked about Tom being the encoder. The level of work in the book, the content and the way it's arranged and the encoding, and I will explain the encoding, so just hang tight for a second. It's extremely impressive. The encoding basically is highlighted words throughout all 666 pages that give little snippets of comments or little sentences throughout the 666 pages to kind of summarize things. And I'll show you an example of that if that doesn't make any sense. And I mentioned the fact that Paul McCartney, in my view, well, Bill Shepard's use of the Paul McCartney name is a corporate fiction or a straw man. It's a character that he plays. So if I go to the next slide, this is from Memoirs, page 107. He says, as myself, I am still William, Will, Billy, or Bill, but my stage name, Sir Paul McCartney, takes the bill and pays the bills well too. But whether Bill, Phil, or Paul, it is the same. So what he's telling us is these are characters that he plays. So
Made
very
me think
interesting.
about that song, Little Willie Won't Go. Yeah, I'm going to have to look up who sang that one. Something like Little Willie, Willie Won't Go Home. But oh no, Willie Won't Go. And it's not a Beatles song, but it's another song. And I think that a lot of people have sung songs about, back then, about this whole Paul was replaced controversy.
Well, other bands knew, and
Yes.
we'll get into that because people will say to me, Mike, how could it possibly be that nobody said anything? Well, that's because the people that were in the know were people that are in the club. That's what it comes down to, Patricia. They're in the club. And what's the club? The club is the secret societies. It's the Freemasons. And so when you're talking about like the Who knew, the Rolling Stones knew, Donovan knew, Elton John knew because John Lennon told him.
The band was The Sweets, and it was called Little Willie, and it came out in 1972. They are a UK band. Now, I'm not saying that has anything to do with us, but in some way, it sort of seems as if it's saying that Little Willie is obviously the replacement, and he won't go. He's here to stay. Possibly, maybe.
It could be, and I will also take the audience through other clues. There are lots of clues. There are lots of clues. And as we get through the presentation some more, I will take you through some of those. And you can go to I created a brand new YouTube channel called Mike Williams's Paul is Dead channel. And the reason why I did that was because I was getting so many requests on Paul is Dead information. And then when I was having problems with YouTube going after my content and giving me community guideline strike, I didn't want to lose the Paul is Dead or the McCartney conspiracy stuff, Patricia. So I created a brand new channel, standalone.
Why would YouTube, what would they consider this as bullying? Or
no, not this. No, they got me for a show on some of those events.
Oh, yes, of course.
2 shows, and then he retracted one. But the point being is I got to a point where I thought to myself, okay, I don't want to lose this material. So I created a standalone channel so folks can go there. And I'll send you the link, and we can add it into the description box. And you can go there, and all it is about Paul is Dead. Okay. Now, here's Hugh Harriet's encoding. And I'm going to, I know you guys probably can't see this too well, so just bear with me. So this is a typical page in the book. And if you can't see this, he has certain letters are bolded out. This is the encoding. And this encoding takes place on every single page for 666 pages. So when I said before that there was a lot of work that went into this book, that's a lot of work.
A lot of work in reading it as well. I mean,
right.
This isn't a light read.
Right, exactly. So he's putting this together, and not only are you reading the main text to get the story, but now you're reading this encoded text to get more insights into the story. So let me show you what it looks like. Next slide is the highlights of that page tell a little story. It's a little summary. So I'll read the highlights to you. He says, I play the long-running show. All performances require each to have one role with a name in some other show. So it sounds a little choppy, but what he's saying is, I play in a long-running show. He's talking about being Paul McCartney. And all the performances require to have one role with a name. So he plays various roles, and in the role is Paul McCartney, he's Paul McCartney. Every role has its own name, and the part of Paul is the same. I go by several names. So he plays other characters. I mentioned before, Vivian Stanshall, Phil Ackrell, and so on. Now, in the book, he clearly states, look, don't get upset by all of this, because this is just show business. This is how show business works. So Bill's not losing any sleep over this, other than the fact that he's trying to get people to know that he's the guy that wrote the songs, not a guy that either stepped out or died back in 1966. You see? So it's all show business. It's all showbiz. And
But
that's
more
how
than
he
that,
addresses
there's
this.
a darker feeling to all of this too.
That is a problem that comes through with this in this book. And I have mentioned this to Tom. I had said that even though in the book, Bill tries to portray somebody who is very upbeat, very humanitarian, and so on, the whole bit about how it was put together, the underpinnings, the Masonic.
It's the 666, the 9/11s,
Yeah.
the Aleister Crowley. There's so, well, we haven't gotten to all that yet.
Yeah, it gets very awkward. Now, what I've mentioned to some folks when they brought this up, I said, you have to understand, in their world, in the world of the controllers, this is their world. This is what they're comfortable with. This is what they do. This is how they live their lives. So it's not odd to them. It's odd to us because, well, this is not what we do. This is not how we live our lives. But to them, this is, another day in the park, walk in the park. This is how they operate. So this is why, I'm giving you my insights, my perspectives on this, Patricia, and to the audience. This is why I believe that, they don't see a problem with this. He doesn't see a problem with this, but we will.
Maybe that's taking this back to flat Earth, how all the people who work at NASA who are in the know, and the astronauts, they might be feeling the same as Sir Paul McCartney, the replacement, feels. This is no big deal, not just show business. Maybe they think of it as this is just business.
Yes. In the case of the flat Earth, it is the same thing. It's all occulted. So they're lying to us, but they believe that their lying it's okay. It's okay because they understand and know the bigger picture. And we're talking about the people that are really understand the apparatus, the people that are actually pulling the strings, the controllers, those that are in the know, the inner circle, right? They know exactly what they're doing, but in their minds, they believe that there's rhyme and reason, and good rhyme and reason as to why they're doing what they're doing. And remember what I said in the beginning, they look at us as profane, the unknowing. We don't deserve to know. We don't deserve. We are not initiates. We are not we're not adepts. So, and people can scoff at that, and they could say, well, who are they to say, well, I agree. But the point being is they are currently in control, and this is how they look at things.
And maybe that's why they put clues everywhere within Flat Earth and also in this Paul is dead conspiracy. They put these clues there. And if we're, in their minds, too dumb to pick up on it, we deserve to be fooled.
That's exactly right. So look, we're going to put this stuff out there. And if you don't figure it out, it's not on me or them, right? That's what they would be saying. It's not on me to spell it out for you. I'm putting the information out there. But if you're not paying attention or you're too distracted by your football games and your beer and everything else and, and all the other inane, stupid things you do, in your life, well, that's your business. That's your business. And that's how they look at it. In the case of Flat Earth, I had this, not to digress here for a second, but I had a great show with Michael Joseph going back, I guess, about a year ago. And Michael explained, because he is just great with the occult. And he said that the reason why they talk in terms of spheres and circles and curved lines is because in alchemy and in their mystery religion context, spheres and circles and so on are considered divine. Squares are considered profane, right? So when you look at the square and the compass, the square part is think of that as the earth. That's the profane. And the the compass itself, what does the compass do? The compass draws circles and spheres. Okay, so so the way they have this all structured, it's clearly it's all occulted, but they have rhyme and reason behind why they're doing what they're doing.
The sacred and the profane.
Yes. Yes. So when they talk to us about space and all that stuff, what they're really talking about is they're in a very cryptic way, in a very encoded way, they're talking to us about the divine realms. That's what they're talking about. And I would suggest that, and I know you probably know the work, Patricia, but Martin Kenny's work on the cosmic egg.
Yes.
Okay. So I interviewed Martin, and it was really an eye-opener. If you watch Martin's work, you will really start to begin to understand what it is that they are doing, what NASA is doing, why they say what they say, and why it is that they believe what they say. The reason is because they are in these secret societies, and they know exactly what it is that they're putting out there. And that's why they don't lose any sleep over it. So they delineate. So when they're talking about planets and all this stuff, they're talking about divine spheres, circles, orbits, and stuff like that, curved lines. They're talking with regard to the divine realm. That's what they're speaking about. So anyway, I digress there. And
well, like a square, that used to be an insult. Somebody who was stiff, uptight, and not cool. You're a square.
Yes. Yep. Yes. So anyway, so this all ties into this also. So, everything is about all of this occulted or hidden information. And when you start to understand it and you start to dig into it, like I said in the very beginning of the show, it's really unbelievable when you realize that everything's a lie. Everything worth knowing is a lie. Maybe, not you yourself, but you have been taught lies since the day you were born. And you are living in a lie, but you don't even realize it. And it's not until you start to look at this stuff, you start to peel the onion back, you start to realize, like, well wait a minute here. Well, that too? So again, this is why the music thing, the McCartney conspiracy is important, Patricia, because I have actually received emails from people. One of the reasons why I continue to do this is because people have contacted me. A number of people have contacted me. I'm not talking about 1, 2, or 3 emails. And they said to me, this McCartney conspiracy, this Paul is dead conspiracy, woke me up. It was my red pill. For some people, it was 9/11. For other people, it was the moon landing, right? For others, it's this whole McCartney thing. It opened their eyes, and they started seeing. And they're like, oh, okay, hold on a second. And it led him off into other areas of research. It's crazy.
That's why when people say that, how could they keep the secret for so long about Paul McCartney? And what about the other bandmates and the family members and the family members of the original Paul? And that's the same thing they say about the whole flat earth thing and how NASA could be keeping it a secret and all the people involved with building rockets and the astronauts. The same thing. How could they? Compartmentalization and dealings with the dark side.
Yes. And, you cannot downplay compartmentalization. So let me just use this example because I get that question a lot too. And I'll talk about this. I mentioned that the reason why it hasn't been out there is because the people that are in the know, they're in the club. The secret societies take oaths. Those oaths are far more important than any other thing they're going to do in their life. It's far more important than the Pledge of Allegiance. Or your Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or anything else people want to talk about as some kind of meaningful document. Those documents do not mean anything to the people who are in the secret societies, period. It's their oaths. And so think of it in this way. If you work in a large corporation, and I'm sure there are folks that are listening to this that have worked for a large corporation. I used to work for a corporation. Do you know what decisions are being made in the boardroom? Do you know what discussions are being had in the president of that corporation's office or the CEO's office? Do you? The answer is no, you do not. Why do you not know? Because you're not privy to that information. Because in the corporate structure, you're profane. You'd have to make your way up the hierarchy, up the ladder, to get more and more information. And even if you get promoted to the next job, you will be given a little more information, but you still do not know what's being discussed in that boardroom. The only way you know that is if you get to the point where you're sitting in the boardroom. And that structure is how the secret societies work. Think of the secret society structure. It's the same thing as a corporate structure. Like you have your Freemasons, they're in the Blue Lodges, right? Your first 3 degrees. And they're running around, they're doing good work, doing work for hospitals and stuff like that. They're doing good community work. And that's part of the cover. But as you make your way up into higher and higher and higher degrees, you're going to get more and more and more information. And that's how it works, you know? Anyway, so I don't want to be too preachy.
No, I'm enjoying everything. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about Tavistock, because this is really all about Tavistock. Okay. So in the book, we have Tavistock, EMI, and the CIA. So Bill openly talks about Tavistock and their connections into the Beatles. He says the Beatles and the Stones and other bands were Tavistock projects. So the Beatles, and I know there's a lot of people right now going, Mike, stop, please, you're killing me, destroying my world. They are a product of Tavistock, along with the Rolling Stones. The Beatles were portrayed as the good guys, the good boys, and the Stones, the bad boys, right? We've always heard that. The good boys, the bad boys, the Beatles and the Stones. Well, they're both Tavistock projects. He discusses EMI's connections into British intelligence. EMI stands for Electric and Musical Industries. I believe they are owned by Sony today, or they are Sony today. EMI was a British multinational music recording, publishing, electronics device, and systems manufacturing company headquartered in London, England from 1931 until 2011. They had a lot of play into World War II. They own Parlophone Records, which is the label that the Beatles first came out on in the UK. Their first record was Please Please Me on March 22nd, 1963. And it was the dates that they are released are occulted, 322. 322 people will be, that's the number of Skull and Bones, 322. Also, when you take 3 times 22, you've got 66. Okay. And Sgt. Pepper was released on June 1st, 1967. June 1st, 6 times 1 is 6. So when you put Please Please Me, which was the first album that Biological Paul played on, and then Sgt. Pepper, which was the first album that Bill Shepherd played on, when you take the 66 from Please Please Me, and then you tack on the 6 from Sgt. Pepper, you have 666. Okay, so just a little tidbit of information there. Shepherd worked with the CIA and British intelligence. I know this is going to be a hard pill to swallow, via the MK Ultra program in the 1960s to promote LSD. And he was a main cog behind the organization or I should say the organizing of the Monterey International Pop Festival, which kicked off the Summer of Love in 1967. And this is not even a conspiracy. Mainstream articles will openly discuss Paul McCartney's involvement in organizing the Monterey International Pop Festival to kick off the Summer of Love. In the book, he gets into a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'll read that again. Shepherd worked with the CIA and British intelligence via the MK Ultra program. Yes, MK Ultra program, it is real, in the 1960s to promote LSD. All right, and that's why when Bill came on board with the Beatles, he was tasked with kicking off the psychedelic era. So let's a little bit about Tavistock. I won't read all of this, but I'll just read some of the highlights. It was actually started in 1921. Sigmund Freud was considered their prophet. And then in 47, it became, actually it's back up into 1921, it was called the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. In 47, it just became the Tavistock Institute. And it's an independent, not-for-profit organization which seeks to combine research in the social sciences with professional practice. Basically, Tavistock is in the business of mind control and brainwashing. It has ties to British Freemasonry. It's headquartered in London. It has developed or did develop mass brainwashing. Experiments in crowd control methods have been widely used, especially on the American public. All Tavistock and American Foundation techniques have a single goal: to break down the psychological strength of the individual and render him helpless, to oppose the I guess the new world, the world order, the current world order, I guess is what I should say. The techniques help to break down the family unit, also the principles of religion, honor, patriotism, sexual behavior, basically sexual deviance. Introducing that into the mix, we see that today, and this is all used as weapons of mind and crowd control. All right, so it's not a good place. If you go on Wikipedia and you read about Tavistock, it's going to say all like wonderful things. But a good book to read if you want to know about Tavistock is to read the book by Daniel Esterlin, and it's called The Tavistock Institute: Social Engineering the Masses, and you will get a very good understanding of what it's all about. So the Beatles are a product of the Tavistock Institute. They are also connected into Stanford Research Institute. Esalen Institute is basically the New Age movement. MIT, Hudson Institute, Heritage Foundation, Center of Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown, where State Department personnel, U.S. Air Force intelligence, and the RAND corporations are trained. Okay, so very, very powerful stuff, folks.
There's another good book. It's called Laurel Canyon, The Inside Story of Rock and Roll's Legendary Neighborhoods. And it's by the author Michael Walker. And it explores some of what you're talking about, how all of the music at the time was social engineering.
Yes. Yeah. Going back to Laurel Canyon. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit too. Because the bands that came out of Laurel Canyon, I mean, these are bands that, Patricia, I know you and I are around the same age. I mean, these are bands we grew up with, and many of them were products of Laurel Canyon, which was all CIA and intelligence controlled. Zappa, Jim Morrison, the Eagles, and so on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about who was Bill Shepard. So before we get there, now in the book, he talks about biological Paul and his dreams. Now, some people do not buy this. They believe this may be a thread of fiction that's in the book. I don't know, okay, because I wasn't there. I wasn't when biological Paul was allegedly talking about his dreams to the band members. I was not privy. So I'll just tell you what the book says. McCartney was having, I'm talking about biological Paul, the real Paul, was having recurring dreams, nightmares in which he died. He was basically predicting his death. He had become obsessed with the dreams, and it was preoccupying him. He was talking to the other band members about it. He would talk to John and George and Ringo about it, but they didn't take it seriously. And according to Memoirs, biological McCartney was planning his departure and his replacement. And this is discussed in chapter 14 of the book. So this is kind of interesting because if this is true, it's very weird. Right. So you have to
Maybe he was lying, bio Paul, and saying that he was having dreams that he would die so that the press or something would pick up on it. And then later, I don't know. There's so many ways to look at it. Or he could have been given the dreams. If there is some way these controllers can control what goes on in our mind.
Yeah, it's very weird. And like I said, it could be complete fiction and it could be true. I'm just putting it out there that this is what the book says. This is one of the premises of the books, that he was having these dreams, that, his demise was very near. Okay. All right. So we'll get back to biological Paul, but let's just talk about Bill Shepard and who he is. All right. So he was, as I mentioned before, an unknown session musician, William Wallace Shepard, or Bill Shepard. His aliases: Billy Shears, Billy Shepard, Vivian Stanshall, right? Billy Pepper. Now, let's talk about Stanshall a little bit. Stanshall he had kind of this very weird act, almost like a vaudeville act out in the UK. And, they had a band. It was the doodah band I mentioned before, and he would dress up in different costumes and so on. And he doesn't look very much like Paul McCartney. And he talks about this in the book. Okay, but I'm going to take you through the transformation. Now, if you go on Wikipedia and you look up Vivian Stanshall, you're going to see that Stanshall died in 1995. But the thing was, that was not a literal death. That is when Stanshall's character was retired by Bill Shepherd. Shepherd stopped playing Vivian Stanshall. And the primary reason why he stopped playing Stanshall in 95 was because Linda was diagnosed with cancer. And those dates, they align. He died on March 5th, 1995. So when you do the numerology or the gematria, you're getting the sixes again. There's 66 chapters in Memoirs, 666 pages. Stanshall's number is 66 when we take a look at the date of his death. I mentioned he is a formerly trained musician. We're talking about Bill Shepherd, descendant of William Wallace. He's a high-ranking Mason. He's 5 years older than biological Paul. He worked with the CIA and British intelligence, and Paul McCartney works through him through the other side. That's the occult piece of it, right? Now, Shepherd being a high-ranking Mason, I'm going to say this is my insight. Okay, this is Mike talking. This is not in the book. I believe he is in the illuminated degrees. I believe he's beyond the 33rd degree today. Now, in the book, he has a very interesting chapter called Masonic Checkmate. In this chapter, he explains the following. He explains the G in Freemasonry represents God, geometry, gatekeeper. 33 degrees equals the 33 vertebrae of the spine. He states there are 13 degrees above the 33rd degree, known as the degrees of the Illuminati. The 13 degrees correspond to the 13 major parts of the brain. Masons do much of the Illuminati's networking, and he references the Committee of 300. High-degree Masons receive the secret Luciferian rituals. There are 20 degrees of rank above Illuminati that few humans have ever heard of. Satan/Lucifer rules the world. This is in the book, in a chapter called Masonic Checkmate. In fact, he mentions Satan, and then he says, but it's really Lucifer. Shepherd states that his uncle, who was a very high-ranking Mason in 1966, called George Martin on September 12th of 1966, the day after Paul McCartney allegedly died, and ordered George Martin, didn't tell him or ask him, ordered him to have Shepherd replace McCartney. So you can see that, I mentioned before, when you take a look at these secret societies, think of them as like there's a hierarchy, there's a reporting structure. So his uncle was a higher ranking Mason than George Martin. And he told George Martin, this is the new guy right here. End of discussion. Shepherd said he was selected because of his long qualifying lineage, going back to his Scottish bloodline, back to William Wallace, and his musical talent. The same uncle that ordered George Martin to put Shepherd as the replacement for biological Paul was responsible for Bill Shepherd acquiring his talent. And in the book, it says, this is a quote, and in anticipation of that day. Now, I don't know if that means that day, the day of Paul McCartney, or that day when something would open up and there would be some opportunity, whether it be the Beatles or someplace else, in which he could step in. He does not give any information on his uncle. And the only thing that I can conjure up, and again, this is a guess on my part, the song Uncle Albert, his post-Beatle era, perhaps his uncle's name was Albert. When George Martin, who was told by his uncle to put Bill in place, caught up with Brian Epstein, who I believe was also a very high-ranking Freemason. I believe he was a 32nd degree Mason because of his death, and we'll get into that a little bit. Epstein had stated to Martin that Shepherd had already been selected. Somebody had already gotten to Brian Epstein and said, That guy's in. Put him in. He openly discusses, Shepard does, mysticism, including Aleister Crowley, Kenneth Anger, who was really the successor to Crowley, esoteric symbolism, and Satanism. Now, in the book, he disavows Crowley. He says Crowley is a doctrine of hate, and he says he's not a Satanist. I found this very interesting, and maybe I'm too profane to understand it. But he explains he leveraged Satanism to achieve success. It seems
that's supposedly what a lot of stars, you hear that about Beyonce and many others. And of course, the Rolling Stones from the Beggar's Banquet album from 1967 or something like that, with the song Sympathy for the Devil. It's written by both Mick Jagger and Keith. It's like they're almost saying we've made a deal with the devil.
Yeah. Yep. And so to say that you're not a Satanist or a Luciferian, but you leverage it in order to achieve success,
it doesn't work like that.
That's a slippery slope, right? Yeah. That's wanting to eat your, have your cake and eat it too. And I don't know. I have a difficult time with that one. I really can't connect the dots on that one. He's very much into numbers and gematria, even though in the book he states he's really not, but he has a whole chapter dedicated to numbers. He loves anagrams, and he was responsible for the Sgt. Pepper album. He was responsible for everything about the Sgt. Pepper album, including all of the esoteric symbolism. He has a chapter in the book dedicated to the Sgt. Pepper cover and the angles and the geometry used on the cover, and who's looking in what direction and so on. It is absolutely mind-boggling. I actually took my Pepper album out. I have a huge collection of Beatle albums. I've collected albums from all over the world for many years. I haven't purchased one in a long time, but there was a time in my life when I was on a quest to collect albums from all over the world. And so I took out one of my Sgt. Pepper albums and tried to follow along. And I did a pretty good job, but it was overwhelming. And just to think about what the science and the thought that went into the cover is just absolutely, again, it's mind-numbing. He was responsible for the cover. They like to credit Peter Blake for that, but I guess Peter Blake was just there to kind of set things up the way it's explained in the book. He was responsible for all that. He had set the folks that were involved in the album to go make phone calls and to go write letters to go secure the agreement from the people on the front cover that their likeness and their images can be used. Okay. And he was the one that came up with the entire concept of Sgt. Pepper. And in fact, you're going to hear, if you get some of the John Lennon interviews when Lennon talks about Pepper, John will say that he got a call from Paul, and it was almost like they were invited along, meaning the other Beatles, John, George, and Ringo, to play along on the album, that it was really the mastermind of Paul, which is really Bill. And we'll get into that a little bit too, because Bill sometimes doesn't have nice things to say about his fellow Beatles, especially with regard to work ethic. He clearly comes across in the book as the one that was the driving force behind the Beatles from Pepper on.
But it seems like he was also a put in place / hired gun. So his driving force was the fact that his entire life was essentially a sham.
He was brought on board.
Although very talented, of course.
He's very talented, and I'll talk about that, Patricia. It's
it must
a very
be
good
so
point.
hard for him to deal with this.
Well,
or is it easy because of all the money?
I said it's his world, right? This is how he operates. But I do think what's gotten to him now is the fact that nobody knows who he is, and he's the guy that wrote all these songs for 50 years, whether a Beatle or as part of Wings or other parts of his solo career. Great songs. I have people sometimes argue with me like, "Oh, he didn't write good Wings songs," blah blah blah. I'm like, well, I mean, maybe he wasn't as prolific, and maybe they weren't as quote unquote good as the Beatles stuff. But are you going to tell me that Band on the Run isn't a great song? That Live and Let Die is not a great song? You're going to tell me Maybe I'm Amazed is not a great song? I mean, come on, cut the guy some slack. So the thing is, he's very complex. He's highly intelligent. and he is part of the elite apparatus. Make no mistake about it. And you see this. He's always shaking hands with the Queen. He was knighted twice. You know, so that's who he hangs with. Those are his peeps, the elites. Now I'm going to show you something. This is a chart I put together. I had pieced this together, and I want you to take a very close look at this. In Freemasonry, there is the Red Lodge and the Blue Lodge. And you have the Beatles' greatest hits album, 62 to 66 and 67 to 70. You have the Red Lodge. You see the red apron below, the Beatles' 62 to 66 greatest hits album. And then to the right, you have the Blue album, and you have the Blue apron from the Blue Lodge. And take a look at the dates. 62 to 66, Goodbye, Paul. 1966 is when Paul left. 67 to 1970, well, Billy's debut with the Beatles was Sgt. Pepper. June 1st, 1967. And the lyric in the song is, I don't know why you say goodbye, I say hello. Right, so Hello Goodbye is a Paul is Dead song.
Now, Paul and Billy, in that, the picture has been changed.
They're two different people. So
yes, of course. But I mean, that's some would say, Mandela effect. But I mean, literally somebody photoshopped or...
What they did was they went back. I think that was EMI. That's the EMI building, if I'm not mistaken. And so what they did was, Patricia, they had them reenact that pose for the Blue album. Okay,
so it's reenacted. Thank you.
It's reenacted, yep. But you can clearly see that. I mean, if you take a close look, those two Pauls, they do not look alike.
Because it's so small, I didn't see the rest of the Beatles and how they, facial hair, and they've completely changed. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry.
No problem. But you could see here now, we have the whole Masonic thing, right? Another Masonic piece of symbolism where we have the Red album representing the Red Lodge and the Blue album representing the Blue Lodge. This is why even today, red and blue is favorite colors of the Freemasons. You go watch your cable news network, all you're going to see is red and blue. Right? People dressed in blue ties, women in red dresses, blue dresses, red ties, and so on. So that's what this is representing, along with other things. There are also psychological effects of the color red and blue on the human mind, but we won't get into that here. But you can see here, and I ran this by Tom. I said, Tom, do I have this right? And he wrote me back. He says, Mike, I like the way you think. Okay. So this is not coincidence, folks. And like I said, once you start reading the book and you start piecing all this other stuff together, you're going to see that there's no question that the guy today is not biological Paul McCartney. So when Billy arrives, he's a session musician. He's very good. He plays guitar. He plays tuba, piano, clarinet, trumpet, I believe flute. I don't have that on the chart here. And in the book, he talks about voice matching, which means that he can imitate voices. And he had mentioned that as a session musician, he would be asked to come in and do session work and to sing and sound like another singer, like a more famous singer. And he would be able to do that. And so that's how he was able to essentially impersonate Paul McCartney's singing style, although it's not perfect, but I will admit he does a pretty good job of it. So he was known as the man of 1,000 voices because of this. And of course, that is a Fool on the Hill lyric. He is a wind instrument player and a piano player. This is why, starting with Sgt. Pepper, you see Paul McCartney playing a lot of piano. And before 1967, you didn't see Paul McCartney play really any piano. He might pluck on it every once in a while, but he wasn't a piano player. Most of the piano work that was done, recorded by the Beatles from 63 to 66 through Revolver, was done by George Martin. Not the Beatles. But then from 67 on, well, we have this guy playing Lady Madonna. We have this guy playing Let It Be. We have this guy playing Martha, My Dear. So where did all of this piano talent come from? I mean, did he teach himself to be that type of piano player within a couple of years?
And had his earlobes changed and had braces and, changed his height. Yeah.
So if you look on the Sgt. Pepper album, if you have one, folks, take it out. Okay, you don't have to do it now. If you have one now, it's great. Take a look at the front cover and take a look at the instruments that each of the Beatles is holding. So you've got John holding a tuba, you got Ringo holding a trumpet, you got Billy holding a clarinet, and you got George holding a flute. Those are Bill's wind instruments. And if you watch him perform as Vivian Stanshall, those are the instruments he's playing. In fact, I have a video on my Paul is Dead channel where a few years back, he was on a street corner in New Orleans, and he bummed the trumpet off one of the corner bands, and he started playing the trumpet. And he was playing When the Saints Come Marching Home. I believe that's what he was playing on the trumpet. This is going back just a few years ago. So when did Paul McCartney learn to play the trumpet? Right. So all these things are starting to come together. He was selected the day after McCartney's accident. So he was Johnny on the spot on September 12th. He claims he met the McCartney family. Now, this is kind of weird, interesting and weird at the same time. He met the McCartney family along with the Ashers. That was Jane Asher. That was McCartney's girlfriend at the time. And he was accepted into the fold because he was going to continue their sons, or the McCartneys, their sons' legacy. Now, I don't know, if something like that happened to me and I was the dad, I would be going along with this. But just, again, this is what's in the book.
But sometimes I think, just theoretically, if you were presented with something as huge as this, you might understand that you can't refuse, even if it's not said outright. Because once you're told about an operation such as this, they're not going to let you say no and then walk away, because you'll tell other people. And I think about Jane Asher and how she would have to suddenly start having sex with a man that she didn't know.
Yeah, well, if she did, they from the book, it didn't sound like they really hit it off. He in the book says that he fancied her. He thought she was attractive, and she was a very attractive lady, and but she wasn't smitten with him. And so how long was that charade going to last, right? So I think that was part of the problem there was, she wasn't taking to him. Now, Jane Asher was an English actress, later on an author and an entrepreneur. She achieved early fame as a child actress and worked extensively in film and TV throughout her career. So now we're seeing somebody who's in the entertainment business. So keep that in mind, right? So we have somebody in the entertainment business. Richard Asher, who was her father, was an eminent British endocrinologist. And he was also the senior physician responsible for the mental observation ward at Central Middlesex Hospital. So whenever you start getting into that type of work, you have to start to question Tavistock's involvement, mind control, because it's in the business of psychology and psychiatry. He was found dead at the age of 57 in 1969 in his basement, allegedly suicide. And if I recall, I think they couldn't find him for like a week. They found him in his basement. Now, we can read into that. I don't know what to say. I mean, perhaps what was going on had gotten to the point where he was either going to say something and he wasn't going to do it anymore. Who knows? Shepard produced Mike McCartney's McGear album in '74. Okay, he claims that that's his brother, and people say that's kind of an interesting duo there because they look nothing alike. He also produced I'm the Urban Spaceman for the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band with Neil Innes of Ruddles fame. And the Ruddles, again, were a Beatles parody band, which included Eric Idle from Monty Python. So, all these people are just kind of hanging together, right? We have Monty Python, we have Neil Innes, Bill Shepard, who did his Vivian Stanshall bit, who Neil Innes was in that band. So, again, we've got this they're all connected.
And also more mentions of space. You were talking about how the person currently portraying Paul McCartney had a song involving Mars and Venus, I think it was.
Venus and Mars.
Venus and Mars.
That's the Venus and Mars album, yeah.
Well, of course, it's that time frame where that's all being talked about as well, but really seems as if they were tasked with also promoting the lie of space and space travel at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well be. And again, from their perspective, when they talk about space, it's from an esoteric, occulted perspective. And those of us, that were not and no, like I said, they call us the profane. We interpret things differently, but that's not how they see it and perceive it. So anyway, he refers to the McCartneys as his adopted family, Patricia. Now, I have kind of put this out there. It's like, I don't know for sure, but it's possible that biological Paul's father, Jim McCartney, was a Freemason. That's, from my perspective, looking at this is the only way I can see this working. That there has to be some Masonic tie all around. Because to show up with some guy the day after your son is killed in a car crash and say, he's going to replace your son, what do you think? And that's just too weird. So there has to be something going on there where there's these ties. Now, on this slide here, I talk about whether he's William Campbell or not. In the book, he says he is not, his last name is not Campbell. I've had people write me and say, he's a liar, Mike. He's a liar. I'm like, okay, but I'm just telling you what's in the book. And again, what I tell folks who want to argue with me about that is, I don't really care what his last name is because I want to focus on the psyop. But to talk about it a little bit, in the book, he says that he's not, his last name is not Campbell. There was a writer, his name was Fred Laborde, and he reported on the clues that he says we provided, meaning himself and the inner circle. They gave them to Fred Laborde, which means that Fred Laborde is part of the club. And he embellished it a bit, making up some material. It was Laborde who named him William Campbell. And he set Campbell as his family name. And he said the surname stuck. But he says, coincidentally, I do have Campbell relatives. So that's how the Campbell name came about. People say, oh, William Campbell or Bill Campbell. He claims that that's how it came about. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that's what he says. Now, here's one that a lot of Paul is dead researchers really start to dig into, because it was figured out a while ago that it was highly likely that Phil Ackrell of the Diplomats, this is the band from the early 1960s, in which Bill played with Denny Lane. But at the time, we didn't know it was Bill. It was Phil Ackrell and Denny Lane played. So this was the excerpt from the book in which he talks about whether he was Phil Ackrell or not. And this is when I went back to Tom Uharry, and I said, Tom, I don't know. It's kind of fuzzy. Was he or was he not Phil Ackrell? And Tom updated the memoirs. And so in October of 2016, you can see the highlighted words. If you can't, I'll read them. He's talking about Phil Ackrell, and he says, he was a fine person. I am them. So what he's saying is, the narrative says, if I were Phil, why wouldn't I admit it now? He was a dandy singer and a guitar player and a fine person. Who would this Bill rather have been than Phil?
For those who missed the earlier part of the show and how you were talking about encoding, please explain how those special words are picked out to be read, that are highlighted to be read together to make a new hidden sentence. Okay,
so let me go back to the prior chart. So in the book, along with all the text that's in the book, Uharriet, who is called the encoder, Tom Uharriet, he bolds out certain words on every single page. And when you read those bolded out words, there are messages throughout the entire book, 666 pages. So what you're looking at now, and I know it's tough to read, folks, but you may see the bolded letters, top right and then in the middle. So as you're reading the text, you're getting all this. And then when you take a step back, you say, well, let me read the bolded letters now. What do the bolded letters say? The bolded letters say from the very same text, he was a fine person. He's talking about Phil Ackrell. And he's talking about, and then he says, I am them, meaning I am Phil Ackrell. I am the diplomats. Now, Tom made that update after I sent my email off to him, and then he supplied me with this. So on the album, Venus and Mars, there's a song that kicks the record off called Rock Show. And the lyric for that song starts off this way. What's that man holding in his hand? He looks a lot like a guy I knew way back when. It's Silly Willie. Well, Willie is Billy. It's William Shepard with the Philly. And Tom wrote to me, he says, Mike, everybody thinks it's Philadelphia, but it's not. No, with the Philly, the Phil Ackrell band, which was the Diplomats. Could be ooh-wee. So another clue for us all. So again, the clues continue. They continue on. And that was a pretty good one, I have to admit. And I always loved that song. When I was a kid, I used to play it and sing it. And now I know what the song really means. All right, so let's take a look at Bill Shepard as Phil Ackrell and Paul McCartney. Okay, so on the left, you've got Phil Ackrell from the early 1960s. Look at the right-hand side of that picture. Now, this might be difficult to see, but take a look at the eyebrows, the nose, the mouth, and the chin. And the eyebrows appear to be a bit surgically altered. In other words, they were lifted a little bit. But if you take a look at those two guys, those are the same guy. I don't know if you could say it, Patricia, but take a look.
Oh, I see it. And I can see it, but then there's that part of my mind that won't allow me to, you know?
I know. But take a look at his nose. Look at the flare of his nose. Now, remember at this time now, it was at this point where he's having surgeries, right? So things are starting to tighten up a little bit, but you could still see it. The eyes were surgically altered to give him that kind of that, you know, that, what do you want, a droopy type of look that McCartney had? Puppy dog eyes or whatever we call them. But look at his nose. Look at the mouth. And look at the elongated chin.
Yes, the chin definitely gives it away. It's a total different chin than the bio, Paul.
And you're looking at probably a 10-year differential.
Yes. The surgery in general, plastic surgery, we've all seen photos in all these tabloid magazines. Joan Rivers, plastic surgery gone wrong. The woman who made herself look like a lion. As you get older, a lot of times you either have to continue doing more plastic surgery and start looking more and more like a freak, or you stop and then you start looking horrible.
Right.
What about Paul McCartney now? Is he in a continual mode of having surgery?
I think what's happening now is his skin, because of his age, has lost its elasticity. So all of the fillers and the surgical enhancements that he's had over time, it's not holding up as well. And I'll show you a picture of him today and how he looked when he was Vivian Stanshall. Back also in the 60s, and you will see, I think, that there's a very close resemblance, especially between his son James and Vivian Stanshall. There's a very, very, very strong likeness. And before we get started into this, I want to just do this. Let me go to this chart because I think this will help people.
Right now, he looks like a man who is in his 80s that's had some touch-up plastic surgery.
Yes. And he's also wearing a hairpiece today. He's also wearing a wig today. That's not his real hair.
To me, that just seems like somebody in Hollywood. I'll write it off as that. But then when you know the rest of the story, then you think, I see what's going on.
Now, when we get into the whole transformation of how he looked as how Bill Shepard really looks and how he was transformed into McCartney, people struggle with it. Like you just said, your mind is kind of fighting the comparison between Phil Ackrell and McCartney. Again, a 10-year difference in the pictures, but still your mind's like, I don't know. Take a look at Michael Jackson. Look at the top left-hand picture, then move to the right, then move to the right, then move to the bottom left picture, move to the right, and then the last picture on the right. This is what they can do with surgery. Now, I'm not saying he had good surgery. I'm just saying, if you look at those pictures, if you look at this, the second picture on the top row, and you compare it to the second picture on the bottom row, and if I said to you, those are the same people, and you didn't know who Michael Jackson was, most people would say, no way. That is not the same person. Nose is different, mouth is different, eyes are different, hair is different, chin is different, but they are the same person. And it's all
The only
because of
thing the
surgery.
same is the voice. But of
Yes.
course, with Michael Jackson, he didn't have to become someone else aside from with the surgery. He was always Michael Jackson.
Okay, so I'll move through these slides quickly because I know I don't want to, have people glaze over. But here's another picture of the diplomats on the left-hand side, and I have some green arrows pointing to Denny Lane and Bill. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, you have Denny Lane and then Bill, and then Linda with him. Hold on one second. So I'm going to give Patricia a link to this because it's best that you see it and hear it. But in, I think it was last year, there was an interview that was done by Outlaw Renegade Nation on YouTube, and they interviewed Denny Lane. And in that interview, Denny Lane has, you could just see, he has kind of a little smirk on his face, and the host asks, what was it like to play with Billy Shepherd? And Lane responds by referring to Billy Shepherd as Billy Shears, which is Shepherd's stage name from Sgt. Pepper. But Lane never mentions Paul McCartney's name during the dialogue. Never mentions the name Paul McCartney. And then the host then assumes that Billy Shears means Billy Shears Campbell, the last name Campbell. So at the very end of the interview, before the camera goes off, Lane rhetorically asks at the end, who the hell is William Campbell anyway? And so what he's doing is he's correcting the host's reference to the Campbell last name. So Lane never mentions Paul McCartney, calls Shepherd Billy Shears, which is his alias, because Shears is a play on Shepherd. And he discounts the last name of Campbell.
Do you think there's a connection between the song Penny Lane, the last word spelled L-A-N-E, and Denny Lane, L-A-I-N-E?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you something funny about names, though. Either it was Denny or it was Phil April. I had done a presentation, and I got an email from Tom. Tom says to me, Mike, you have to be careful on the spelling of it. Maybe it was Denny Lane, I think. It could have been Phil April. We're going back now, like a year ago or so. He goes, some people got upset. So I wrote him back and I said, well, if they got upset, Tom, don't have them go to you. They can come to me directly. And if I had a typo on a chart, which I don't think I did, I don't know. I went back, I looked at it. I'm like, I don't know. But in any case, maybe I did. But I never got a response back to my response back to him. So kind of interesting. So what that told me was that there are people listening that, well, I'm assuming they're probably getting a good chuckle out of it, quite honestly, right? Because it's 50 years later, and we're just now getting it. So
this and the whole Apollo hoax, these are two huge things that happened in and around the same time frame. And I agree with you. There are some people out there that are, as the expression goes, laughing up their sleeve.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, and they are listening and watching this stuff. They are. I mean, they're having fun watching, the profane, learn a little something. And they also know that the magnitude of the learning curve is incredible. And we're only going to just touch a smidgen of that information, and get bogged down with additional disinformation every which way we look, So that's why they don't lose any sleep over this stuff. All right, so let me just take you to this slide here. This is the one that people get all jammed up on. The evolution of Bill Shepherd. So on the left is Bill as Phil Ackerl. I just showed you that. Then you see him second from the left as Vivian Stanshall. This is him older now, okay? And then you see him second to the right with the glasses. That's the same guy as the guy in the center to the left of him. But he has changed drastically. His appearance has changed drastically. So you have this transformation within the Vivian Stanshall character that apparently nobody questioned, which I find absolutely phenomenal.
Well, the time frame when there was the original Beatles with the, we all remember the very skinny suits and the skinny ties and the clean cut and the mop top. And then they moved through the period where they got more with the facial hair, the whole 70s thing, the paisley clothes. So the way that the hair was done and the clothes and the facial hair really helped distract so much from the actual face underneath it all.
Yes, and especially with the Beatles, that's what they did. With Sgt. Pepper, they changed everything, the whole look. And they overloaded the senses. So they just didn't change Paul. They just didn't swap him out. They changed everything, the look of everything. But take a look at the transformed Stanshall with the glasses, and take a look at Paul on the right with the kind of the red jacket, and take a look at the similarities there. Now, what you have is Shepherd as McCartney on the far right with a wig on his head. It's a wig. All right. And they rounded out his face, and they did this with fillers. In the book, they also talk about the fact that he also uses latex. And I have proof of the latex with two videos I found. One is a rehearsal of Jet back in 1973, where the latex and the fillers kind of shift around on Bill when he's singing, and it kind of droops into the lower part of his neck. Very strange.
I had a Halloween costume, and I've worn it back in 2015 on one of my shows. We called it Flatoween, and it was a Star Trek science officer, one of the blue vintage Star Trek original series uniforms. And I bought these special silicone latex ear pieces to glue on the top of my ear, and the special glue. I mean, this was the real Hollywood stuff to make my ear pointed like a Vulcan. And I couldn't do it. And my friend helping me couldn't do it either. I don't know what kind of makeup artist you would need to glue this on and have it stay on for a whole night or a whole recording session. There are fails when it comes to that stuff, for sure. And you can tell up close that you're wearing a prosthetic.
And I have another video where in the 80s, he's interviewed by Bob Costas, and he puts his right hand up toward his temple, and he leaves it there for a second. Then when he pulls his hand away, the latex does not flex back. It basically leaves the imprint of his fingers on the side of his head.
So his face was made of Play-Doh, essentially.
It sounds weird, but I'm telling you, I have those two videos, and if you watch them, it's very clear. And in the book, he says plastic surgery, fillers, and latex. And when we talk about plastic surgery, folks, we're talking about we're talking about reconstructive surgery.
And there's doctors then, and nurses and hospital staff who know about this.
Yes. Yes. This is not a facelift. We're talking about reconstructive surgery and, like I said, fillers and latex. I mean, this is all out.
The healing process for real plastic surgery, if you look it up online, is months and months. It's not just, in the blink of an eye. It's bruising and stitches, and it's a mess.
Well, that's why in the book he says that there were others that played the part of Paul. He's the one with the main contract. He's the one with the permanent contract. But there were others that stepped in here or there. And that's why I'll get to a slide, and I'll show you the various pictures of Paul McCartney over time. And you can see that some of them are not Bill Shepherd. Okay, there are other players that page in and out, probably for some cameo appearances or whatever it may be. And I'm assuming that they stepped in because of times when he did have to go in for surgery, or he just needed a vacation. He needed a break from playing the character of Paul McCartney.
Yeah, I can
Now,
imagine the telephone call. Sorry, my eyes are black and blue and swollen shut, and I've got a bunch of scars and stitches and blood.
yeah,
And so someone's got to be me for 3 months.
right. So there were others that paged in and out, but they did not have the long-term permanent contract like he had, and he's had it since 1967. Now, on this slide, quickly, again, this is Vivian Stanshall with his band, and you could see on the left and the right, that is the same guy, folks. That is not a different person on the right-hand side. It's the same guy, but it's after all the surgeries, and nobody picked up on this. I don't hear anybody ever talking about the fact that Vivian Stanshall went from this kind of this redheaded, kind of like this Scottish looking guy to this more redheaded, effeminate looking guy on the right hand side. It was just this huge transformation. And the transformation that was taking place was he was doing double time. He was still doing the Viv Stanshall bit, and he was also playing Paul McCartney. Okay, so it just wasn't one thing or the other. He was doing both at the same time and other things. Okay, so now this chart here is just, just to kind of wrap it up, you could see if I superimpose those two faces, and I actually have a chart like that, but I didn't include it in this deck, you'll see that it's a very close match. The only thing we see differently here is the nose, the flare of the nostrils on the left is because they weren't done with working with the nose yet. But you can see how the eyes are taking shape. You can see how the face is taking shape. Stanshall has, or Shepherd has thinner hair also.
Everyone has the symmetry of their face is different. So one side is higher or one side is lower. One eye is bigger, one eye is smaller, some to a larger degree than others. My face is not symmetrical. But in this case, when you're looking, you do see the eyes of both men are different. So it looks like if this is indeed true, the surgery is still sort of in process. In
process, right. So this is, so we don't know exactly when, the picture of Shepherd of Stanshall was taken, but it's in process. And we know that something took place because if we go back to the other picture, we could see here's Stanshall really before the surgeries. But what they did do is they started filling out his face, because here he is as Phil Ackrell. You could see, how he has that narrow jawline, long jawline. Here they started to round it out with fillers. And now we start to see this much more different look. They start to change the eyes. The nose actually is starting to look a little different from what we have here. So the transformation is taking place. Now, how it was done, I'll go through this quickly. I mentioned plastic surgery, fillers, and latex. He claims that he's spiritually connected to Paul. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's referred to as Paulism. He claims that Paul influences and channels, and it's from the great beyond. Bill is Paul, Paul is Bill. This is how he explains it. He utilizes and leverages mysticism and the understanding of his esoteric teachings. He was tutored by Brian Epstein on biological Paul's mannerisms and quirks. He had to master Paul's arching eyebrow. He said it took him a long time to do that. He's naturally right-handed, and he had to learn to play left-handed. He claims he did this by playing the Revolver album over and over and over again, and eventually he channeled Paul to help him to make the final transition, because up until that point, he was struggling to be proficient at the bass playing left-handed. He's very proficient right-handed. He claims in the studio, he records right-handed. So this is interesting, right? So that means that people who are working with him in the studio, engineers and producers, other band members, well, how is it that Paul McCartney, who is famous for his left-handed bass playing, picks up the guitar and starts playing right-handed when he's recording? Okay, so he mentions this in the book. The way it was done was it was assimilation by association. So people see what they want to see. So presentation is everything. He was pictured with the Beatles as Paul McCartney. Therefore, who else would he be other than Paul McCartney? He is taller. He has a narrower facial configuration. That's why they had the fillers. He has different ears. He has bigger feet. He and the other Beatles, he says this in the book, were amazed that all of this wasn't figured out by the public. The physical attributes plus the song clues, which were pervasive. And it didn't really publicly emerge until 1969. And Shepard and the Beatles were actively leaking these clues. And they started it with Fred Laborde, who was writing for a newspaper at the time called the Michigan Daily. And that was back in, I think it was October of 69. As I mentioned before, he states that there was more than one replacement for Paul, but he has the permanent contract. Other bands were well aware of the replacement. Donovan was conversed with Bill Shepard a lot. The Stones, in fact, Mick Jagger was a little pissed off at the whole thing because Jagger's take on it was they were breaking their backs, the Stones, doing concerts, recording, and all this stuff, as were the Beatles with biological Paul. And all of a sudden, this guy steps in, and in Jagger's mind, he didn't pay any dues. How is it that you've got all this now and you haven't done anything? And he explains this in the book. And then eventually, Jagger gained a lot of respect for him because they realized that he was a very talented and skilled musician, songwriter, and performer. The Who knew, Denny Lane knew, Elton John knew.
And these other people also are living in some way lies. Something about their lives are also occulted.
Yes.
No, they're okay with it because they're doing not the same thing being replaced, but they're doing other things. They're making deals with the dark side.
Yep. And in the book, he says to Patricia that some people were paid off to be quiet. He says, not a lot. He doesn't give any details as to who was paid off. Or there is one, there was a reporter who goes by the name of Sam. And he's mentioned in Band on the Run as Sailor Sam. I'll talk about that a little bit. But everybody else, basically, that was that. And that's because it's the club. They're all in the club. So if you're in the club, you're not going to talk about it because this is the way it works.
This couldn't really have been pulled off as easily today because we have the internet where we can look at face shapes and we can share with everyone like this. The same thing as the Apollo moon landing. The way that they pulled that over our eyes, you watched it once on a black and white scratchy, screen. And now, of course, we have better tools to analyze. But of course, before Flat Earth came along, I thought everything that was happening with NASA was totally legit. So maybe if they replaced, I don't know, a singer I liked with somebody else, I might not notice myself because we all know musicians, just like actresses and models. It's what they do. They change their appearance all the time.
Yes, that's right. And again, it's all showbiz. And if somebody wants to dig into it, I haven't yet, but it's always been rumored that Bob Dylan was swapped out.
Wow. Maybe even some of the earlier astronauts were swapped out. I mean, who knows?
If you go back and look at pictures of early Bob Dylan and then, pictures like 5 years later, you're like, that doesn't look like the same guy. But that's, like I said, I'm digressing now, but there's just so much of this all around. Now, here are the pictures that kind of kicked it all off. I had put these pictures together a long time ago. Well, 2 years ago. And so you had just mentioned, Patricia, because of the internet today, we could do more assessing and reviewing and forensics, if you will, right? We could take a look at things. Well, back then, when they showed you a picture of Paul McCartney, he was in a magazine or whatever it may be. I mean, you had no comparison. That was just what they showed you and told you. Well, that's Paul McCartney. Okay. But if you take a look at this, and hopefully you guys can see it, the two upper left-hand pictures are biological Paul. These were taken in 1964 and 1965. And you start moving to the right, and you can start to see that, things are starting to change a bit now. And you could go down to the bottom row and take a look at some of these characters. And we've got this guy here, this guy here. We've got this fellow here. This has to be one of the stand-ins or the temporary Pauls.
So different.
So different. And then we've got this guy here. Now, this is Shepard. This is Shepard with his mullet back in the early 1970s. Okay. So you're taking a look at each of these pictures, and it's not coming together. So I'm going to show you the next slide now. I did another one. Same two pictures on the top left, a biological Paul. Now take a look at these pictures. Well, who's this guy? Okay. That looks like Shepard to me here. That's him. That's him here.
He looks weird there with that cigarette, though.
I think it's a straw. Yeah.
Okay, straw.
It looks like a cigarette, though.
would be a mighty big cigarette. I should have looked more closely, but he looks weird to me there.
And look at this guy. And this guy here, does he look like that guy? Right?
So weird.
And then look at this.
Bingo.
Look at the two right-hand pictures, folks, on the bottom row. Who? Really? That guy is that guy? No. So that's why I put this chart together. That guy is not that guy. It's not the same guy. It's not the same guy. Two completely different people.
I say just with that little picture there, case closed.
Yeah, they're two different people. And the reason why back in the early 70s when he was walking around with his mullet, that, we didn't question it was because, well, nobody was really going back to this picture because we didn't have the internet back in 1973 and doing comparisons. I guess you could go back to books and stuff like that. And some people did, by the way. It's not like everybody was oblivious to it, but the vast majority of the population wasn't paying any attention to all of this. All right, so I know we're getting long on time here, so I'm going to just finish up with two things here.
You've captured everyone's attention, so don't worry about that.
Okay, all right. I can't see what's going on, folks, in the chat or.
It's buzzing along. We've got 225 people viewing, so we're good.
All right, so here are the key dates that took place. Now, look at how closely all this came together. So this really starts to beg the question, like, okay, well, was this a quote unquote accident, this car crash, or however he died or however he left? Again, if he didn't die, he was swapped out, replaced. Maybe he stepped out. So again, Paul McCartney dies in a car crash late in the evening on Sunday, September 11th, 1966, allegedly decapitated. There was a lady passenger named Donna. The bodies were pronounced dead after midnight on Monday, September 12th, 66. The song Lady Madonna really is Mac Donna and contains the chronology and the days. So go back and listen to Lady Madonna. Brian Epstein meets Bill Shepherd on September 12th and brings him on board. Shepherd was known as Billy Pepper and was recording Mercy Beat albums, which included Beatle cover songs. That album was referred to titled Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, and now you know where you get Sergeant Pepper from. Brian Epstein sends Lennon a telegram. Lennon was in Paris at the time. That was on Tuesday, September 13th of 1966. Donna's parents were notified of her death on Wednesday the 14th. Epstein introduces Shepherd to John on Friday, September 16th. This is 5 days after Paul dies, and that meeting takes place in Paris. I mentioned the song Lady Madonna. Now, Shepherd, before he's going to do all this, because everything in his life is going to change. He's going to undergo surgery. He's going to have fillers. He's going to have to walk around with latex, and things are just going to change. He can no longer live the life of Bill Shepherd. So he has to make it worth his while. He did not like the Beatles' love songs. Please, please me. I want to hold your hand. She loves you. Think of all the early Beatles stuff. Going all the way up through Revolver, even though with Revolver, some of the songs started to shift. With Revolver, you had Tomorrow Never Knows, which is a psychedelic song that John Lennon wrote, right? But in the book, Shepherd absolutely loathed these songs. And so he wanted to take the band in a different direction. Lennon was in total distress, and he agrees to Shepherd's demands to relinquish control of the band. And so he hands the band over to Bill Shepherd. And Shepherd becomes the new leader of the Beatles. Now, when we talk about a new leader of the Beatles, I like to think of it more in terms of the Beatles now have an internal handler. Somebody in the band is now the handler. And that's essentially what, in my view, my opinion, Bill Shepherd became. He was in the band. He was an incredible creative force, but make no mistake about it, he was the guy that was in control. Sgt. Pepper is Shepherd's debut album. And interestingly enough, the song Sgt. Pepper, the title track, and Fixing a Hole were allegedly written by Shepherd and Beatle manager Mal Evans, and who I also believe was a handler. And Evans died in 1973 under very strange circumstances. And the story behind Mal Evans's death was that at the time he was carrying around a manuscript, a tell-all about the Beatles. And he was shot dead, I believe it was in London, by a policeman. And people who knew Mal Evans said the story didn't add up. They said he had become belligerent and he had become angry, upset, out of control. And people who knew him said, yeah, he was a very big guy. He was very tall, but that was not his personality. So people who are into the McCartney conspiracy and the research question that story. It's most likely that Mal was walking around with that manuscript and he was not going to publish it. And I believe the story goes that he had the manuscript in a briefcase, and when they found Mal dead, guess what wasn't there? The briefcase. So very interesting, very interesting details around this whole thing. Now, Pepper was his debut album. Sgt. Pepper, the front cover, obviously, is a funeral scene. The album is entirely Bill Shepherd's concept. I mentioned that Evans died suspiciously. I said 76, 1976. Shepherd designed the entire project, including the album cover. It was not Peter Blake. Pepper is riddled with Masonic symbolism and death clues. I explained that there's an entire chapter in Memoirs that is dedicated to the geometry and the Masonic symbolism and all this stuff that's on Sgt. Pepper. It's absolutely stunning. You'll hear a lot of people who go into Paul is Dead clues talk about the palm over Paul's head. Right, the palm is over his head on the Sgt. Pepper cover. You'll see it over his head in Magical Mystery Tour. Well, here is in the book, it's explained as to what it means. The palm is Paul M. Palm, Paul M. So the palm over his head is saying he is Paul. He is Paul McCartney now. That's what's explained in the book.
Wow.
Okay. Shepherd, when he did Sgt. Pepper, was immersed in it. He put in very, very long hours. It was his baby, cradle to grave. He states that in the book that the other Beatles did not have his work ethic. He's a self-proclaimed perfectionist, and he would actually redo band member tracks. Now, some people cringe at that, but there is a video that I have, and I'm going to upload it to my Paul is Dead channel, where there's an interview with him. I don't know how long ago it was, but he talks about how he was told to go screw off by Ringo and George for being too much of a producer, too much of a take charge, too bossy in the whole process of recording. And he then says, this is very, I found this to be an insult. And there's a couple of things he says in the book that I found to be probably not things he should have said. He even mentioned one of these things to Tom, where he talks about biological Paul having monkey ears. I'm not kidding you. It's in the book. And I said to Tom, I said, it probably could have been left out. But in any case, in the interview, he talks about the fact that the reason why he did the drums on the song Birthday was because Ringo couldn't get it down. Ringo couldn't do the drumming to Birthday. Now, I don't personally believe that story because the drumming in Birthday is not elaborate. It's very simple, straightforward, 4/4 time. It's not brilliant drumming by any stretch. And there's no question in my mind that Ringo Starr could have easily have done the drumming on that song. So something else was going on there. So I don't know whether it's because perhaps the drum track was already down and Ringo did it, and he decided he was going to go in and do it his way. I think that's probably more likely the case. But again, that's conjecture on my part. The relationship with the other Beatles was up and down. Lennon was particularly harsh and difficult at times with him. And in the book, he says that he's the one that dissolved the Beatles due to friction and souring relationships with the other Beatles. And post-Beatles songs communicating the fallout. The most famous one of all time is from Lennon's Imagine album is How Do You Sleep? After you get done listening to this presentation or you read the memoirs of Billy Shears, go listen to that song and everything in that song will make sense to you. He, a Shepherd, after listening to or hearing How Do You Sleep, which was a direct attack on Shepherd by Lennon, he released the song Three Legs. My dog's got three legs. My dog's got one leg, but he can run. So he was alluding to the fact like, hey, I might be by myself, but I can do it. The song I'm the Greatest by Ringo Starr, which was actually written by John Lennon on Ringo's 1973 Ringo album. At the very end of that song, well, before we get to the end of the song, there's a lyric in the song that says, my name is Billy Shears. You know, it has been for so many years. So Ringo is telling us there that, you know, it's Billy Shears. And at the very end of that song, Ringo sings, I'm the greatest in this world, the next world, in any world. And what I believe that Ringo's alluding to there is Bill's, his expertise and his knowledge in the area of the occult and the esoteric and mysticism. I'm the greatest in this world, the next world, any world. And that's at the very end of the song. Also, Ringo released a song called Back Off Boogaloo. Now, Boogaloo is a genre of Latin music, which was popular in the United States back in the 1960s. And in the book, Shepherd says he liked Boogaloo music. And the Beatles used to rib him and the other Beatles, and they would nickname him Boogaloo. So Ringo wrote the song Back Off Boogaloo. And if you take a look at the 45 sleeve of that record when it came out, on the sleeve is a picture of Frankenstein. What is Ringo telling us? Well, what is Frankenstein? Frankenstein is a creation, right? So what Ringo is telling us in Back Off Boogaloo, Back Off Bill Shepherd, and that sleeve with Frankenstein on it, by the way, with like handcuffs, I believe, like broken handcuffs on his hands, meaning, you know, he's handcuffed to this whole Paul McCartney thing now.
Yeah, his hands are tied.
Your hands are tied. You're stuck with this now. You're stuck with this. Okay? So there are clues all over the place. Now, before Sgt. Pepper, we were all given a clue. I was probably too young for this, but
that looks like artwork on that particular thing you're showing from the artist famous at the time named Peter Max.
I don't know. Yeah, it could be Patricia. I don't know, but let me tell you something about this album. This was the very first clue that was handed out that biological Paul was no longer with us. This is an album, a Beatle album. It's called A Collection of Oldies. But looking at that album cover, you don't see the Beatles. You see this man on the front cover, dressed in very psychedelic 1960s attire. The only time you see Beatles is the text on the, looks like a drum he's sitting on. And it says a collection of Beatles oldies. This album was released December 10th of 1966. The Beatles' first album, Please Please Me, was released only 3 years earlier, March 22nd of 1963. So how could the songs from 63, 64, 65, and going into 66, how could they be oldies? They're not oldies. You would call them greatest hits, but not oldies.
I just looked it up. The art was not done by the artist Peter Max, by another artist, though, who has similar psychedelic vibe. And Brian Epstein is the one who commissioned and wanted that artwork.
Yeah. Yep. So that artwork, this album is a transitioning from phase one of the Beatles, biological Paul, to phase two, which is Bill Shepherd. The guy on the cover is Bill Shepherd. And if you take a look at old pictures of him as Vivian Stanshall, you're going to see that kind of attire. It's very, very similar to the way Shepherd used to dress. So the psychedelic cover here introduces a new era of Beatle music. The Beatles are going into the psychedelic era. And Shepherd is the man on the cover.
According to Tavistock, everyone else is coming along for the ride, whether they like it or not.
That's right. So this is 7 months before Pepper was released. This is the first clue for everybody. This is the first clue for us all, was this album. A collection of oldies which has Bill Shepherd on the front cover. If you didn't, at first glance, you would not know that's a Beatles album. Okay? Now, there were some close calls. Back in 1966, when the alleged car crash took place, there was a reporter. His name was Sam. He knew of the car crash, and he confronted Brian Epstein and was very persistent. Epstein threatened him with a libel suit and then paid him off. Sent him on a little vacation. Sent him on a little cruise, is the way the book puts it. He went on a cruise. And therefore, we have Sailor Sam being mentioned in the lyric in Band on the Run. That's Sam the reporter who went on a nice cruise as he got paid off by Brian Epstein to shut up about this thing. There were voice print analysis done in 1969 by a Professor Dr. Henry Truby, University of Miami, which published the fact that the new and old Paul have different voice prints. They're called sonograms, proving again they cannot be the same person since each voice print is unique like fingerprints. He compared Yesterday versus Penny Lane and Yesterday versus Hey Jude, and it was published in Life magazine, and it went absolutely nowhere. Nobody cared. But he proved that there were two different singers on two different songs that were two different people than biological Paul.
I heard that the replacement Paul, or Fall, as some call him, fake Paul, the current Paul McCartney, was accused of having a out-of-wedlock love child. And yes. Paul McCartney, that we know, provided a DNA sample, and it did not match up.
Exactly. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. That's a very excellent. You've done your homework, Patricia. Okay, so the voice prints. Now let's go to Japan, January 1980. Some folks might remember this. So he was grabbed in Japan. He was going to do a tour. And at first, he wasn't going to be allowed in Japan to play because he had prior drug convictions. And there was he got caught with pot possession in Japan. And he stuck it in his bag, he said, because he was arrogant. And he said he wasn't going to be told what he can do and can't do. And he's, quote unquote, Paul McCartney, so he can do whatever. So he admits in the book that he got on his high horse and he made a big mistake. So the Japanese opened his bag, found the pot. They interrogated him and figured out he was not Paul McCartney, but an imposter. And they figured this out because the Japanese had different fingerprints from Interpol. Evidently, biological Paul he did something in Germany. I think he had set a fire or something, and he had gotten arrested when he was a kid. And they took his fingerprints, and his fingerprints wound up at Interpol. So then when Bill was in Japan and he got caught with his pot, with his weed, they took his fingerprints again, and they're like, hey, these are not the same fingerprints. He was accused of forging passports and being a government agent. He spent 9 days in jail in Japan. Now, who got him out? The UK government and Scotland Yard. Okay? So it's good to have friends in high places. Mm-hmm. They got him out. But he did have to cancel his Japanese concert tour, which, according to the book, really upset Denny Lane, because I guess there was a lot of money in it, and Denny didn't see the paycheck he wanted. Then there was the paternity suit, which you were just referring to, in 1982. So there was an affair for 18 months that biological Paul had with Erica Hubers in Hamburg. The relationship was well established. They had a daughter out of wedlock. Her name was Bettina Hubers. And today she's known as Bettina Crispin. Hope I got her name last night. Bettina, if I don't, I apologize. Child support was paid by biological Paul and by Shepherd, playing the character as Paul due to contractual child support obligations. So he was contractually obligated to continue those payments. At a certain point, he didn't have to make those payments anymore. It's like in the United States, in most states, you don't have to pay child support after a child turns 18. You can just stop. If you want to continue, that's fine. That's your call. But in most states, 18, you don't have to pay child support anymore. Well, the mother took McCartney to court stating that he owes more than child support because of all the fame and fortune, and it's his child. So Shepard submitted DNA, which of course did not match. Shepard was accused by Erica Hubers of sending an imposter for the DNA sample. Okay, so things started to get really sticky here. Then they analyzed signatures. And he had signed a document. This is how, if I recall this, he signed a document. The mother, Erica Hubers, knew Paul, biological Paul's signature, and said, that's not his signature. The German court actually had to go get old documents that Paul McCartney, biological Paul, signed, and the signatures didn't match. But it didn't go anywhere. It perplexed a lot of people, but it didn't go anywhere. So the Hubers sued for fraud, and the case was abandoned in 2007, and it was abandoned because the statute of limitations for fraud had expired. And in the book, he says that he is not responsible for any of biological Paul's illegitimate children. And he says he's not going to intercede. He's not going to say anything. He's not going to speak about it. He says he's going to let the DNA speak for itself because he knows that the DNA will not match, and therefore he's off the hook. Interesting stuff, right?
Very. Wow. This is so deep. This is so multi-layered.
I know. Am I crazy for looking at this or what?
No, because I've been looking at it too, thanks to you. And, you know, so have many people who are in our live chat. People are coming up with all sorts of interesting things that they've discovered. Somebody was talking about a Sgt. Pepper's mirror trick using the cover of the album. And I asked him to explain that. And he said it shows some Freemason temple stuff with Crowley on the top and the all-seeing eye if you use a mirror.
Yeah, and it's all kinds of stuff on the Sgt. Pepper album. I mean, the Sgt. Pepper album is like filled with Masonic symbolism, filled with it. All right, so let me just, I know folks are going to want to hear some more of these clues, Patricia, and I don't want to keep you here all night. Virtually every Beatles song, according to Shepard, starting with Pepper, has to do with the death of Paul McCartney. Backmasking of lyrics, double meaning of lyrics. Some of the songs, some people may know, Strawberry Fields, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. This is George Harrison actually singing about Shepard. Let It Be. I actually did a backmasking of Let It Be. I put it up on my alternate YouTube channel. And I did it based upon reading the book. He said, this is what they did. And I'm like, well, let me check it out. Let me go validate it. Lo and behold, it was there. Glass Onion, I'm So Tired, A Day in the Life, Hey Bulldog, Revolution Number 9, All You Need Is Love, and on and on and on and on and on. So if you read the book, he goes through many, 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 many songs, and he talks about them. The company, Apple Corps, is a play on words, a Paul corpse, Apple corpse, Apple Corps, a Paul corpse.
Oh, wow.
There is a video of from John's Imagine album where he and George Harrison is sitting down for lunch, and Yoko Ono is there kind of serving tea and stuff like that. And the conversation between George and John talks about Beatle Bill and Beatle Ed. So we don't know who Beatle Ed is. Beatle Ed may be one of those others that has filled in here and there, but it's probably suffice to say that Beatle Bill is Shepard. McCartney was introduced as William in a recording studio scene from his movie Give My Regards to Broad Street in 1984. Now, this can be easily found on YouTube. I have it on my Paul is Dead channel that I've dedicated. If you go to the playlist, you'll see that video. So he's introduced as William. George Harrison in a scene from the documentary Living in the Material World. This is Martin Scorsese's documentary he did about George, dated 2011. There's a scene toward the latter part of, it's like a 3-hour documentary, where George is sitting on a couch and Bill comes in, and they're going to do some recording together. And George welcomes McCartney by calling him William and says, "Hello, William." And Bill leans down and gives George a hug and says, "It's good to see you again, George." Dana Carvey, in an interview, recalling the first time that he met McCartney, and in that interview, now I don't think this interview ever went anywhere. I think it was something that was going to be made and it didn't get made. I could be wrong, but this is my understanding. And in the interview, he slips up and he refers to him as Billy. Okay, and you can find that on my playlist on my Paul is Dead YouTube channel. There's a scene of McCartney playing right-handed on the Beatles anthology, DVD disc number 7, 50 minutes in. The video was mirrored, which means it was flipped. So he was playing left-handed, and then they flipped it in the documentary, in the anthology. And they do this as a wink and a nod. This is another clue for us. So now we have a scene of him playing right-handed. Shepard brings this up in the book, and he talks about it. He says he knows it was done, but he said at that point, he just simply did not care. I have a video of McCartney playing drums right-handed. Very well, I might add. I mentioned the video of McCartney playing the trumpet in New Orleans. So all of a sudden, like I said, we have Paul McCartney. He could play trumpet. I spoke about the video of McCartney rehearsing Jet, where his latex sags into his neck. The interview with Bob Costas, where the latex leaves an impression by his right temple area when he takes his hand away. I'll show you some pictures in a second where Shepard's son James looks very much like Vivian Stanshall. And Shepard, of course, points this out in the book. He says that his son actually looks very much the way he really looks before all of the surgeries. And I spoke to you guys about the Denny Lane interview where Denny pretty much spills the beans in a very, it's somewhat cryptic. It's really, you have to watch it and see that he really is spilling the beans. And then there is a video out there where George Harrison does an Australian interview and he says fall like 3 times within 3 minutes. That's a hoax. Somebody had doctored that particular interview. I have the original undoctored interview and he calls him Paul, not Paul, Fall. So here we go with, in 3 years from 64 to 67, we went from the left-hand picture where we had the, the mop tops to the right-hand picture where we have Sergeant Pepper. And a big part of the PSYOP that Tavistock put in place, the way they pulled this off, was to change everything, not just Paul, everything, the entire look, the music, everything. And what this does is this overloads the senses and it masks the McCartney swap. So you won't just focus on Paul
If
McCartney.
the way they dressed in these suits was the secondary look they went to, and originally they were psychedelic, it wouldn't have overloaded the senses. The way it was played is perfectly. And fashion, although I love it, is also very Tavistock controlled. It's all part of the same animal.
It's all colors, right? Colors are very important to the human psychology. It's all psychedelic, and all the Beatles are very different, So when you looked at Paul McCartney, you would say from 64 to 67, let's say you're looking at the Sgt. Pepper album and you're thinking to yourself, wow, he looks really different. But then you look at John, you go, well, John looks different too. And look at George. And look at Ringo. So everything now is looking different. That's how they pulled it off. It was a big part of how they pulled it off. Now, I'm going to show you guys some pictures, and I'm going to show you why Bill Shepard and his family, right, look the way he used to look. And these are not McCartney children. Okay, these are Bill Shepard children. So here's Bill Shepard and James McCartney. Take a look at the face. Now, James looks very much like his dad. His dad, of course, is on the left. That's Bill Shepard as Vivian Stanshall, replete with the red hair, orange hair, right? And take a look down at the bottom right. I have a little picture of Linda, because somebody might say, well, the nose is a little different. Yes, he's got a little bit of his mother's nose. He's got a bit of his mother's eyes. But his complexion, facial structure is his dad's. Okay, so that's James McCartney. He does not look like biological Paul. He looks like Bill Shepherd.
But of course, hard to tell because biological Paul was so young.
Right.
When he was, when he died, and we don't know how his face would have changed as he aged naturally.
Right. And so what I had to do, Patricia, is, again, I'm basing this on the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. I mean, I don't agree with everything in Memoirs, by the way. I read some comments because people have commented on my stuff and people put words in my mouth. But as I've said when we began the show, there's 666 pages of information. Some of it is fiction. There's no doubt about it. But a ton of it is not. And so he's telling us in the book that he was Vivian Stanshall. He's telling us in the book he was Phil April. So I had to go back and say, okay, you're telling me that you were these people. Now, can I in some way validate it? Can I connect the dots? And this is what I did. So when I started going back and taking a look at the pictures, I'm like, okay, all right. I mean, if somebody said, hey, that's that guy's son, you would say, yeah, he looks like his dad. He has a bit of his mom too, Let's take a look at the next picture. Now, I don't know if you guys can see this. I hope you can. On the left is Shepherd as an older McCartney. You can see where the fillers and the surgeries, because of his age, they're not holding together as well as they used to when he was younger, because the elasticity of the skin, the muscle tone, and all that stuff is not how it used to be when you were 30, 40 years old. This picture is probably when he was in his 70s, and he's 81 today. Look at his son. Then look at the picture of Shepherd as Stanshall. Now look to the right, and you see a younger James McCartney. James McCartney, which is Shepherd's son, James Shepherd, I guess. And below that, I have a little picture of his dad.
So, do you think that James knows that that's not his dad?
Oh yeah.
It's interesting because James has receding hair, and he's younger, and it happens to everyone at every age, women as well as men. But you were saying that Fall, the man playing Paul McCartney, wears wigs.
Yes,
and that would be because he was losing his hair at an earlier age.
Yes, let's take a look at the picture here, Patricia. Look at the center picture.
Mm-hmm.
That is Shepherd after transforming all the surgeries, going from the left-hand side.
Who looks like his son. I mean,
look at the hairline.
Yeah.
The receding hairline.
Yeah.
You see? Okay. So that was the next picture I was going to take you to. So again, how did this take place? This wasn't a nip and a tuck. This wasn't a facelift. This is reconstructive surgery. This is latex. This is fillers. Now let's take a look at the next picture. This is, of course, again, another picture of the same picture of Shepherd as Stanshall. And take a look at McCartney later years. This is probably around, I don't know, we'll say about 5 so years ago. And you could start to see where the resemblances are starting to come back, because the face, like I said, the elasticity and the muscles are not holding it together anymore. It's getting more and more difficult to do that as he ages. The nose is different, yes, because the nose has been it's been surgically done.
It also could be a hair transplant as well, with all that money that's being spent.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting story. I remember reading a story where Heather Mills, when he was married to Heather, who, by the way, she said that he has secrets, and she was paid off $50 million when they settled that divorce settlement. I think it was back in 2008.
Right. It could be for more than just the fact that they split up.
Maybe. Oh, yeah. She came out and said there were deceptions. I mean, this is what she was telling everybody.
But I mean, it's not just a deception like he cheated or something. This is massive.
That's what she said too. I believe she said it wasn't infidelity.
That's right. I remember reading it now. Yes.
So, I mean, so once she said that, people are like, well, what the hell else could it be? So you're looking at this picture now, and, just look at the eyes, right? Look at the facial structure. He's got that weird chin thing going on because he's had all those fillers and stuff, but, that's him. That's him many years later. And, so that's pretty much, I don't want to I have other stuff, but I don't think we have to go through the rest of it. I just want to pretty much end there because we're almost 3 hours into this, Patricia, and you've been very patient.
Oh, no, it's not patient. I'm fascinated, as is our live chat. So I think anyone watching this at a later date would say the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So the summary is biological Paul was Beatle Paul. Remember this, folks, for only 2.5 years. The real Paul was only in the picture for 2.5 years. March of 63. I'm just starting with their albums. I know they went back to Hamburg. I'm talking about when they hit the big time. 63 until September of 66. Right? He died or replaced on or about September 11, 66. As I mentioned earlier, some researchers like Tina Foster, a great researcher, thinks it was August. Some believe it was November. The book says September, but it doesn't matter. The guy was swapped out. Whether he died or he just stepped out, again, doesn't matter. Think in terms of what took place. One of the most famous musicians and entertainers of the time, at the peak of their popularity, was replaced. And nobody noticed. And it's been going on for 50 plus years. He was replaced by a Freemason. He calls himself Bill Shepherd. If you want to replace Shepherd with Campbell, be my guest. Shears, Jones, Smith, doesn't matter. But he was replaced by this very high-ranking Freemason. The Beatles were and are a product of Tavistock. And a lot of people will have a lot of trouble with that. But that's it. That's the truth. They are a product of Tavistock. The Beatles are cloaked and soaked in Masonic deception and ritual. In my view, I think this whole thing is a deception. Regardless of how Bill tries to portray it in the book, it's all showbiz and everything else. It's disheartening. And from somebody who was as much into the Beatles as I was, and I still love Beatle music, but I have to tell you that this research has put a different perspective on my view of the Beatles. It's no longer this picture of a band that was organic, super talented, super creative. Not to say they weren't talented and creative, but you know what? As a Tavistock product, they got a lot of help. A lot of help. And which includes being teamed with George Martin. And which means having state-of-the-art recording facilities at the time. Which means George Martin playing keyboards on many of the earlier pieces before Shepherd showed up and started playing on Pepper in 67. Okay, so the imposter, Bill Shepherd, has been playing the character of Paul McCartney for over 50 years. Biological Paul, 2.5. Bill, 50 plus years.
And how old really is, if all of this is true, the current person playing Paul McCartney?
81. He's 81 today.
So at that age, sometimes people just drop dead of a heart attack.
Yep.
So you were saying earlier that you think he might want to let these secrets free.
Yeah, I think, Patricia, that, and again, I conversed with Tom on this, and and it was a conversation we had via comments on Facebook. There was a post that went up, and this went back months ago, and I had said, Tom, it's got to be very frustrating to have written all the songs that he has written, and nobody knows who he really is. I mean, that would be like me writing songs, Patricia, and going under some alias. And then, after a while, you start to think to yourself, well, nobody knows that Mike Williams wrote those songs. And it's starting to bother me. I'm the guy that wrote those songs. So I think that,
yes,
I believe that's exactly where he's at right now. And I'm using me as an example, and I'm like a minuscule, minor example. But think about his portfolio of work, Patricia.
Everyone wants credit for what they've done. And you know how Barry Manilow had a song? I don't like Barry Manilow, but I write the songs that make the whole world sing.
Yeah.
Well, who really wrote the songs that made the whole world sing would be Paul McCartney and or the Beatles. But
right.
He must feel ripped off, but then he's been so well rewarded.
it's his own doing. You see that I don't have a lot of compassion for him, because when he did it, and let's face it, there was a huge payoff. Huge payoff. Now, it almost didn't work, okay? And I think Tavistock was watching, and they're thinking, well, we might not be able to pull this off, but if we do, I mean, this is going to be amazing.
Because but we haven't really touched on, with Tavistock's involvement, the actual purpose for this. Was it to get people into sex, drugs, rock and roll, distract them from the realities of the world, and change the way our morals and values are? Or more than that even?
It was to introduce the psychedelic era. It was to introduce drugs into the culture, in particular LSD. It is social engineering. So Tavistock social engineers and mind controls through music. Music is a very, very powerful tool that they have in their toolbox. So the Beatles, when they first came on board as a Tavistock project, they took it from the 1950s, Elvis and all that stuff, to we've got these mop tops and we've got these crazed young girls. They were really the first boy band when you think about it. And they were introduced.
Some of the crazed girls at Elvis concerts and early Beatles concerts were brought in by bus to do the screaming and ripping off of their bras and all of that.
And in the beginning, some of them were paid, and that was to be able to create the demand. And then after a while, what happened was they didn't have to do that anymore. It caught on. You see the psychology of that?
Yes.
So all of a sudden, you didn't have to pay anybody anymore. You didn't have to bus people in anymore. They just showed up and screamed and carried on like a bunch of lunatics, right? So that's the Beatles brought that in. The Beatles brought in, started changing the dress, the hair, and all that. And then come 1967, the Summer of Love, boom, you've got the drug culture and you've got the psychedelic era. And that's what they did with the Beatles. That was the purpose. And I think from a Tavistock perspective, this is a monumental win, beyond probably anybody's wildest dreams at Tavistock, that they have been able to do what they have done with the Beatles for as long as they have been able to do it.
A lot of people feel things like LSD, acid, can, and I'm not saying I do, I'm just saying some people feel they can bring your mind to another realm and give you insight and ideas that are positive.
Yes.
So if that were indeed true, then why would Tavistock want this unless they know for sure that LSD is completely bringing you into a very negative realm, and that's where they want people?
LSD, those types of drugs, you have to know how to use them.
And they're made in a lab too. They're not natural.
And they're made in a lab, right? So, when they're rolling out LSD, they're not teaching people how to microdose, right? So today, the elites, and I read an article where a lot of the brain trust in Silicon Valley, they microdose LSD, which enhances their creativity. It enhances their imagination. It just opens up all of these other channels. But the thing is, they're using it and dosing in a very specific, controlled manner. That's very different than distributing LSD to the masses with no instructions or directions on how it's supposed to be used, dosage-wise, when, and so on. And I mean, it's well documented that people who have taken LSD have had very, very bad trips. And so they were experimenting with it. I think that it's very possible that they were just putting it out there. Hey, let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens to human behavior.
Right.
Let's see what happens to human psychology. Yeah, if when they're running around and they're all dropping acid. Let's see what happens, because this, Patricia, right, as well as anybody. They look at us as like lab rats. We're guinea pigs.
And also amusement, I think, too. They want to control us and manipulate us.
Yeah.
and create in us a desire to buy certain things and everything that we do, all of the ways that we are, even with the internet right now, Facebook and YouTube and everything, we are programmed. Our data is collected, and we are directed to shop in certain ways by what comes up on our screen, and we follow along. But I think in all of this, they get us to do, like a good doggy, what they want, but also it gives them some, I think it gives them some amusement. I picture them sitting at a giant chessboard, and we're the pawns, and they're moving us around, and they are amused.
Yeah. They have a completely different way of life than we do. They have different priorities, different lifestyles, everything is different. Everything is different. You know, if you go to England, right, you have the royal family, and everybody else is known as a commoner or a subject. I mean, just sit back for a second and put that into perspective. You're a commoner, or you are a subject, you know? So this is how they think, and this is how they operate. They don't lose it. They don't lose any sleep over us. If people die from drug overdoses because of programs that they have initiated and they've put out there, they don't care. They do not care. You know, so this is what we're up against. And like I said, for a lot of people, I have not run into one person yet who has read the book. And a lot of people have read the book. They've gotten back to me who said, "Oh, that's just an inspiring book. It's so uplifting that Bill wrote." Everybody views it as dark. There are a lot of dark elements to it. It's not everything is dark about it, but you get into some of this stuff, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you're like, wow. I mean, this is not uplifting material. But he thinks it is, apparently. So, that
what
just
if we're
tells you.
wrong? What if we're wrong? And the Beatles conspired to do this a long time ago, to put out these little Easter eggs for us to find, to make themselves more popular, because mysteriousness breeds popularity. And, here we are talking about them right now.
Yeah.
Maybe Paul McCartney is original Paul. Maybe we're fools. And maybe the elites are laughing at us anyway.
Well, I could tell you that their record sales did increase significantly when the rumors came out. Okay. So from a marketing perspective, it was very good marketing. It was a very good ploy. But nobody today will ever convince me that the guy there today is biological Paul, based upon all the work and the research I've done, Patricia. I just don't buy it. George Harrison, there was no love lost between Bill and George. And there's a lot of interviews in the 1980s where George really was very snide and didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Paul McCartney. And that seems like a very, very odd relationship, a way to conduct your relationship if you were supposedly childhood friends. McCartney, the way the story goes, was the one that introduced George into the band by having George play for John, because it was John's band at the time. John was the leader before it was the Beatles. So, George, there was a lot of animosity there, and it didn't really get better until the 90s when they did the anthology documentary. Some of the songs that Lennon wrote, like "How Do You Sleep?" I mean, that's just punching him in the face.
Yes, that's true. Everyone needs to go look at the "How Do You Sleep" lyrics.
Yeah. Just take a look at them, So I don't know. Like I said, I used to believe it was a marketing ploy. I used to think that it was a way to like, hey, it's just kind of tongue in cheek. It's those kind of clever, witty Beatles doing their thing. They're just so clever, and I lived with that for a long time and believing that. And when I read the book, I had to go back and relook. And so today, like I said, the guy today is not the guy that was originally there.
Thinking it's a marketing ploy might be akin in Flat Earth to thinking that, well, we didn't really go to the moon originally because it was a space race and we had to pretend so we could beat the Russians, but then we did later. It's like this safe little conspiracy to get to, so you don't look at anything deeper.
Yeah, what it is people like to rationalize. People don't like their bubble burst. They don't like, to have their world turned upside down. there are certain things that you're very close to. I mean, look,
I want my world turned upside down. Weirdly enough, I love this stuff. I'm not sure that any of the things we speak about are indeed 100% truth, but I know there's so much truth to them. And it makes me so happy to look at all these details and uncover all of these horrible things, because it's so much better. You feel cleansed by being closer to the truth.
Well, when you think in terms of even, like the flat earth stuff, and, a lot of people, they have lived their entire lives studying the heliocentric model or watching it or watching movies and stuff like that. And they have it's almost a romance with it. And I'm not picking on the heliocentrists, okay? So if you guys are out there and you're heliocentrists and you're listening to this, I'm not picking on you. I personally don't care whether you believe in the heliocentric model or the geocentric model. I personally do not care. But the thing is, we have affinities for things. And it's like with this whole thing with the Beatles. A lot of people have an affinity for the Beatles.
It's like, I want to believe Santa's real when you're a child.
Yeah.
And you still pretend, even if you know it was
not bad. It's like, hey, you mean Superman's not real? There's no Cape Crusader, And as a kid, when you learn these things, at first you're kind of devastated by it, right? You're like, oh, are you kidding me? But you get over it. And that's how I look at this stuff. You learn it, you research it, you have to get to a point where you're like, okay, it's not what I thought it was. It's time to move on and move through it. So
this has been wonderfully enjoyable, even if it's a very sad and very cryptic topic. I thank you for coming on. And in the description box is your original channel, The Sage of Quay Radio Hour, Mike Williams. And I'm going to put your Paul is Dead channel. What is the name of the channel? Paul is Dead?
Mike Williams's Paul is Dead channel.
Okay.
It's not the best name, but I figured it was probably the best way to get people to pick up on it.
It is, because they'll know who you are and what the topic is, most definitely. And I'm going to put a link to the book. Could you give us the title of the book one more time? I'm going to get my hands on that book.
It's the Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas U. Harriet. And Tom, if you're listening, I hope I didn't divulge too much and make you uncomfortable. I tried not to.
Well, you probably sold the book, so he should be thankful regardless of what you
Yeah, I have no financial interest or anything.
Yes, of course, either do I.
But they are excellent books to read. And if you're a Beatle fan and you're into this stuff, and I mean, you won't be disappointed. I promise you will not be disappointed.
Off topic when it comes to conspiracy. Let's pretend it's back in the day when you just thought the Beatles were the Beatles and you loved them. Favorite song or favorite album?
Oh,
I hate when people ask me that question. People ask me about the Smiths, and I can't answer it because it's all time and place, and it all depends on you and where you were during the time an album or a song came out.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I will answer the question. I would say that Strawberry Fields Forever was always a song when I listened to it. It was just very fascinating to me. And to this day, I could still play Strawberry Fields Forever and still be very, very engaged with the song. I just love the song. Now, there's many other songs too that I love, but there's something about Strawberry Fields Forever. And it's probably something that Tavistock put into the song to make sure you have that affinity for it. But in any case, I love Strawberry Fields Forever. My favorite album is Abbey Road. And I think Abbey Road is a masterpiece from the songwriting and the production. Just a brilliant album. And of course, other Beatle albums were great too. And but there's just something about Abbey Road. I think that the first song, I should say, the first track, Come Together, is probably one of the best and coolest songs that John Lennon ever wrote.
And of course, it's got the replacement Fall on the front barefoot. So that's another element added on top. Yeah,
with his ridiculous explanation on the David Letterman show. He said he was barefoot. If folks had listened to this, hadn't heard this, he was on Letterman in 2009, and they started talking about this whole Paul is Dead thing, which, by the way, came out after an article that was supposed to have been published in Wired Italia, an Italian edition of the U.S. magazine Wired, where Gabriella Carlisi, who was a forensic pathologist, and Francesco Gavazzini is an expert in computer analysis. They took a look at Paul, and their goal was to put to bed finally that biological Paul, the original Paul McCartney, is still the original Paul McCartney, and there was no replacement. And when they did the work, they did not come to that conclusion. The forensics and the analysis showed that they are different people. It was after this that Bill went on Letterman and explained that the reason why he took his shoes off to walk across Abbey Road was because it was so hot that day that he flipped his sandals off and he walked across the blistering hot pavement in his bare feet. Now,
because that's what people do when they're wearing a suit.
Exactly. It makes no sense whatsoever. You would not walk barefoot on very hot pavement. Your feet will burn.
Or just in a city in general, unless you're drunk.
He just came up with that ridiculous,
right,
way of explaining it, and it just fell flat. I think he did himself more harm than good with that one.
Well, it sounds like when anybody is asked spur of the moment questions, any of the astronauts like Scott Kelly asking what those bubbles in space are, and he recently, anyway, claimed it was paint flecks. Just one of those, like, are you kidding me?
I know.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. You got to put your thinking cap on, and think in terms of what's a reasonable explanation. If it looks like bubbles, it's probably bubbles.
And if a guy's barefoot on an album cover, they probably meant it to be that way.
Exactly. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed it. Boy, we've talked to each other a lot on a wide variety of subjects.
Yes.
I wonder what we'll talk about next. Who knows? Hopefully something cool.
We could do a show on reincarnation and past life regression.
Oh my gosh, that would be interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you,
Patricia. Thank you so much.
All right. It's Mike Williams. I'm Patricia Steere. This has been episode number, I can't even remember, of Flat Earth and Other Hot Potatoes, 225, the PID show, the Paul is Dead show, or Paul is Dead and Other Hot Potatoes. Hope you've enjoyed it, and keep it flat.